Chapter 1254. The nearest international hospital to Malibu Beach in Los Angeles. Fong Ling went to have her blood tested and did several other tests. In the end, she confirmed that it was indeed just an upset stomach. The doctor asked her if she had eaten something cold a few days ago. Fong Ling recalled that the bacon she had eaten in the past few days might not be easy to digest, and because there was too much meat, she was afraid that it would go bad after a long time. She didn't want to waste food, so she ate more than usual and ate several meals in a row, causing food accumulation. Furthermore, when she drank water, she often drank cold water when Li Nanheng wasn't paying attention. If there was no hot water, she would drink cold water. This might have caused a burden on her stomach. That was why she suddenly experienced nausea, vomiting, and loss of appetite. Right now, she felt disgusted when she saw bacon because she had eaten too much these past few days. After confirming that she was not pregnant, although Li Nanheng knew that he was usually very careful and that the possibility of pregnancy was not high, he still held the test report with a look of disappointment. In fact, he should be more careless occasionally. Perhaps in a few months, his child would be born. When did he, Li Nanheng, become so obedient? He actually restrained himself every time to prevent her from getting pregnant. What are you disappointed about? Fong Ling snatched the test report from his hand. It's not time yet, Tisk, how can I not be disappointed? Li Nanheng hugged his little wife and walked towards the hospital parking lot. If I'm really pregnant now, can't I go back and get married immediately? The sooner I marry into the Li family, when I return to the base, I won't just be little Fong Ling in the eyes of those grandsons. She'll be Mrs. Li, my wife. As the man spoke, he leaned down to her ear. Why don't we go back tonight and make a baby? Fong Ling originally thought that she was really pregnant last night, but now she knew that it was just a misunderstanding. It was just an upset stomach. She couldn't tell if she was relaxed or a little regretful like him. Their relationship was so good. In fact, if they really had children, it would be good. Anyway, as he said, if she had time to take care of the children, she could learn to be a mother. If she really didn't have time, the elders of the Li family could help them take care of the children. This was indeed a happy thing. Hearing that he wanted to make a baby, she did not say anything. She did not object or agree. Seeing that she clearly did not completely reject him, Li Nanheng's eyes lit up. He wished he could bring her back to the car and make a baby in the car. However, after being kissed by him for a while in the car, Fong Ling suddenly said, since it's rare for you to come out, buy some blankets and coats nearby. After all, you have to stay here for the entire winter. Buy a duvet. It's light and comfortable. Sure. Li Nanheng's mind was filled with thoughts of going home to make a baby. It was even better to change to a more comfortable quilt. Without hesitation, he agreed and hugged her to nibble on it. When Fong Ling raised her hand to push his face, he smiled and drove to the nearby shopping mall. After all, this was a scenic spot. There was no lack of anything. The shopping mall was also very close. It had been a long time since Fong Ling had visited such a place. After buying the duvet, she strolled around for a while and bought some other daily necessities. She also bought a particularly beautiful shell wind chime that was commonly seen in this kind of scenic spot with the sea. Fong Ling and wind chime had the same sound. She instinctively liked this thing and bought it. She wanted to hang it in front of the window of the cabin as a decoration. Of course, there was no lack of delicacies from all over the world in this kind of scenic spot. There was a hot pot place on the top floor of the shopping mall. Although the taste was not as authentic as the last time, the soup base was light and the ingredients were enough to satisfy one's cravings. Furthermore, it was not very stimulating to the stomach. After buying a lot of things and eating their fill, they prepared to go back. The two of them had just placed the things they had bought into the trunk of the car and were tidying up the things in the back of the car when they suddenly heard some tourists nearby speaking different languages and pointing in a certain direction. Their words were filled with surprise and bewilderment. Li Nanheng seemed to understand a certain Korean or Japanese language spoken by the people closest to him. His hand that was putting the things into the car suddenly paused and he abruptly turned to look in the direction those people were pointing at. In the distance, the sea was calm, and about 10 kilometers away, in the direction of the jungle where he had accompanied Fong Ling for half a year, there was billowing smoke in the sky. The smell had even gradually drifted to this position, and the air was filled with the smell of burning fire. At this moment, Fong Ling also abruptly turned to look in that direction. Her clear eyes reflected the thick black smoke, and her brows instantly twitched. She abruptly turned to look at Li Nanheng. Without saying anything, the two of them decisively closed the trunk, quickly got into the car, and drove back. The closer they got to the jungle, the more they could feel the burning sensation in the air. When they could clearly see the flames, Li Nanheng frowned. He didn't need to look at Fong Ling's eyes to know her current mood. The flames had already covered the entire jungle. It was early winter, and the air was dry. The trees in the jungle had already turned yellow. As long as there was a little fire source, with the help of the wind, it was enough to make the fire spread very quickly. When they drove the car to a place only a few hundred meters away from the flames, the sea of flames had almost engulfed the entire jungle. He didn't have time to think about their home, their house, and everything they had left in the jungle. Li Nanheng only heard the sound of many fire engines approaching. At the same time, he saw the black MPV parked not far away. When he saw the old couple standing by the car and excitedly wanting to rush into the sea of fire, his brows suddenly twitched. The two elders of the Fong family? They? Fong Ling stared at the sea of flames and followed Li Nanheng's gaze blankly to the two old men who were rushing in the direction of the sea of flames. Her voice was slightly hoarse. Who are they? Grandfather Fong and Grandmother Fong. When Li Nanheng said these words, he seemed to have thought of something. He subconsciously gripped the steering wheel tightly and drove the car over. When the car stopped by the two elders, she had just opened the door when she suddenly heard Grandmother Feng's desperate and pained cry. What should we do? What should we do? They're all inside, they're inside. How can there be such a big fire? What should we do, inside? Who was inside? Li Nanheng got out of the car, and Fong Ling quickly followed him out. When she followed him to the two elders of the Fong family, the two agitated old men suddenly turned their eyes. When they recognized Li Nanheng, they abruptly turned their heads and met Fong Ling's eyes. Chapter 1255. The moment their eyes met, the two old men looked into Fong Ling's eyes and were both startled. Grandmother Fong looked at her with tears in her eyes. She raised her hand tremblingly, but as she looked at her, she anxiously reached out in the direction of the burning jungle. This child, elders, this is. Li Nanheng sensed the seriousness of the matter from the two elders' eyes and frowned. What happened? Grandfather Feng's gaze also fell on Fong Ling, but he didn't have time to say anything. The moment he saw Li Nanheng, he raised his old hand and pointed in the direction of the fire. They're inside. They went in to look for you. Quick, think of a way to save them. Li Nanheng's brows twitched. Who are they? At this moment, Grandmother Fong suddenly burst into tears. She quickly stepped forward and hugged Fong Ling, who was still standing by the side in a daze. As she hugged her, she buried her face in front of her and cried loudly. My granddaughter. You're my granddaughter. Fong Ling. My good granddaughter. Grandma finally saw you. But what should we do now? Your parents went in just now. They thought you were in the jungle and were afraid that our legs wouldn't be good, so they said they would go in to look for you first, but why did it suddenly catch fire? What should we do now? Old Madame Fong cried and sobbed. As she cried, Li Nanheng could roughly understand what was going on. Suddenly learning that Qin Xiao and Mr. Fong were in the jungle, Li Nanheng's eyes darkened. He glanced at Fong Ling, who was still standing there. She didn't know where to put her hands and feet when she saw the old woman suddenly pouncing on her and crying uncontrollably. However, the moment she heard that her biological parents were in the burning jungle, all her hair stood on end. The moment Li Nanheng turned to look at her, she abruptly turned to look at him. Their eyes met. They were used to being in 11 base, so they didn't have anything else to say. The most important thing right now was to save them. How did they get in with such a big fire? Li Nanheng said as he quickly observed the fire above the jungle. Hearing the sound of the fire engines approaching, he turned back to look in the direction of the fire engines and decisively walked toward them. Feng Ling thought that Qin Xiu was inside. That was her mother and her father whom she had never seen before. The habit of every rescue mission and the faint consciousness in her heart reminded her to immediately go to the fire engine with Li Nanheng to apply for the rescue. However, the old woman who was crying so hard that she almost fainted made her unable to retreat. Her hands were stiff by her sides. Listening to the old woman's pained and anxious cries, Feng Ling lowered her head to look at her. Her lips moved, but she didn't know what to say or what to say. At the critical moment of life and death, no one could spare the extra thought to consider what kind of background or how to address them. She paused for a moment and looked up at the old man who was walking over. "Old Mr. Feng, I'm sorry, but I have to participate in the rescue now. Let's save them first, okay?" Elder Feng looked at her deeply and tried his best to suppress his anxiety. He nodded at her and said, "How are you going to save such a big fire? Child, don't take the risk. Your parents are in danger now. If you go in and something happens to them, I'm a member of 11 base. I have professional rescue methods. I've participated in countless dangerous missions. Please trust us." With that, Feng Ling pushed the crying old woman in her arms to Elder Feng. At the same time, she quickly turned and ran in the direction of the fire engine. Grandfather Feng held his wife's hand tightly and looked back at the burning jungle worriedly. The weather was too dry, and the fire was getting bigger and bigger. It was easier said than done to save people in such a large jungle. On the one hand, he was filled with worry, and on the other hand, he was happy to finally see Feng Ling. The two feelings collided. The two old men couldn't bear it and staggered by the car door. "Please be all right. Please." Grandmother Feng clutched her chest, her eyes red. From time to time, she looked at the flames in the sky and then turned to look in the direction Feng Ling had just left. As she looked, she said in a trembling voice, "Old man, that's our granddaughter. Yes, she's our granddaughter." Grandfather Feng sighed. "With just a glance, I can tell that she's an outstanding and brave child." Several fire engines were already in place. Li Nanheng used his phone to contact the nearest rescue helicopter of 11 base. It would fly over in about half an hour. Because they were really members of 11 base, the rescue team had to take out spare fireproof suits, disinfectant masks, and other equipment in the car at their request. Li Nanheng communicated with the people in the fire truck in English the whole time. Feng Ling listened and quickly changed her clothes. Although she was silent and did not step forward to speak, although she looked calm, her trembling hands still exposed the worry and fear under her emotions. It was really too difficult to save the two of them in such a big fire, but the people there were her parents. And the two kind old men just now were her grandparents. They were all family members that she had never dared to hope for. Why did the fire suddenly break out? Why did they suddenly come here? Why did they go in? How could this be? After Li Nanheng communicated with the people inside, he turned back and saw Feng Ling fastening her belt with trembling hands. His gaze fell on her face. At this time, any words of concern were useless. He only looked at her and asked in a serious and low voice, "Can you do it?" Feng Ling did not answer. Instead, she decisively picked up the gas mask and put it on her head as an answer. The fire in the jungle was very big. Although Li Nanheng didn't want Feng Ling to take the risk, she had been on many rescue missions, and they were more dangerous than this. Right now, the people inside were her parents, and she couldn't be left outside. She had to go with them. "After you go in, listen to my commands. No matter what happens, no matter what situation you see, don't be emotional." Li Nanheng warned in a low voice that only she could hear. Feng Ling had already put on the gas mask and looked up at him. "Okay. The sky was dyed red by the flames, and the scorching heat came from the direction of the jungle, making her eyelids hurt. No one would have thought that the forest would be engulfed by a sea of fire just a moment ago when they were still planning to return to the forest and change into a feather quilt to stay for another winter. Chapter 1256. The sudden impact on Li Nanheng was not small, let alone Feng Ling, who had a special feeling for this jungle. However, the people in danger were her parents who gave birth to her. She didn't even have the time to feel sad or regretful. She had to participate in the rescue. She couldn't even have the time to feel uneasy or confused. Li Nanheng looked at her for 2 more seconds and suddenly said sternly, "Feng Ling, listen up." Feng Ling, whose back was slightly sagging, subconsciously straightened her body and stood in front of him with her legs closed. "Yes. From now on, follow behind me. You're not allowed to rush forward alone. You're not allowed to be more than a meter away from me. Even if the home you built with your own hands is destroyed, you have to remember what's more important. If the home is gone, you can build it again. Your life is the most important, understand?" Feng Ling's expression did not change. Her hands slowly clenched into fists in the sleeves of her heat-resistant suit. Although she only answered with one word, her voice was still hoarse. "Yes." At the same time, the 2 elders of the Feng family were quickly invited over by the firefighters to ask what had happened. As the people in the car were all wearing the same clothes and the same disinfectant mask, their faces could not be seen. The only thing the 2 elders could recognize was Feng Ling, who was slightly shorter and thinner than those men. When she answered all the questions, she stared at her and said with red eyes, "My son and daughter-in-law are here to look for their long-lost child." As she spoke, the old lady looked at Feng Ling's mask and stared at her. "We all thought that the child had been inside and wanted to pick her up and let her go home, but the jungle was too big. They didn't come out for more than 2 hours, and there was no signal on the phone. Then, for some reason, a fire suddenly broke out. The wind was too strong, and the fire spread very quickly. My old man and I were afraid that something would happen, so we quickly called the police. It didn't take long for the fire engine to arrive, but the fire was already terrifyingly big. After learning the general cause and effect, the fire brigade arranged for all the rescue and fire prevention equipment. If it was just a forest fire, there was no way to control the fire rationally. They could only wait for the fire to gradually become smaller and control the periphery to not be burned. After understanding the general cause and effect of the fire brigade immediately arranged for all rescue and fire prevention equipment. If it was just a forest fire, the fire could not be controlled rationally at all. They could only wait for the fire to gradually become smaller and control the periphery so that the fire would not spread to more places. But now that there were people in the jungle, they had no choice but to take the risk to rush in to save them. In such an endless jungle, they had no idea where the 2 of them were. In such a sea of fire, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack, and they were risking their lives to fish for it. Feng Ling jumped out of the fire truck with everyone. Old Madame Feng watched her figure with reddened eyes. Seeing that Feng Ling did not look back and decisively followed everyone forward, old Madame Feng suddenly called her, "Child." Feng Ling's footsteps paused, but she only paused for a moment before continuing. "Feng Ling." Madame Feng couldn't help but rush forward to grab her wrist. "Good child, do you know your background? Do you know what your relationship with the Feng family is? Listen to Grandma. Don't go, okay? You've already suffered for too many years. Don't go." Feng Ling was silent for a moment before gently pulling her hand out of the old lady's grasp. She then turned back and said through the gas mask, "I'll save them. Please don't worry." With that, she left. "Ah, child," Feng Ling. Madame Feng was about to chase after her, but Feng Ling had already walked far away. Behind her, several members of the fire truck came forward to support Madame Feng, who was almost unable to stand steadily. They politely sent her and Grandfather Feng into the car and let them rest for the time being. Rest? Who could really rest? Grandfather Feng held his wife's hand tightly and looked at the sea of fire. He hated that he was too old. If time could turn back 30 or 40 years, they would definitely rush in to save him. They wouldn't be sitting here crying and being taken care of. There was nothing else they could do. In the end, Madame Feng could only close her eyes anxiously and pray to the heavens, to the Bodhisattva, and to the various gods. In the jungle, no one was more familiar with the environment than Feng Ling. The flames engulfed everything, and the flames and thick smoke also obscured the vision of the road ahead. Feng Ling followed the route in her memory. In addition, Li Nanheng had lived here for half a year, so he was already familiar with many directions and routes. The two of them carried rescue equipment and rushed in first. They stepped on the ground that was barely visible under the flames and leaned forward. The thick smoke was too heavy for them to speak, and the mask on their faces was not suitable for them to speak either. Li Nanheng searched around with the help of the flames. At the same time, his gaze fell on Feng Ling from time to time. He saw that she had been following obediently the entire time and was not too emotional because of worry, but he knew that this was when she was really worried and flustered. The more expressionless she was, the more emotional she was. She was afraid. She was not afraid that something would happen to her. She was afraid that her mother would really die here. This was the place where she could save her life when she was young. She had spent 5 years growing up here. If something happened to her parents here, how would she face all of this in the future? Li Nanheng lowered his head and glanced at the slightly soft mud. He saw 2 pairs of uneven footprints on it. Looking in the direction of the footprints, he pursed his thin lips coldly. Without saying a word, he reached out and pulled Feng Ling to his side. He pulled her forward and silently gave her the courage to persevere. Feng Ling's hand pressed against his hand and did not say anything. Feng Ling pressed her hand against his and did not say anything. She also saw the 2 footprints and guessed that they should be her parents. She immediately clenched her hand in his hand, but after a short while, the man forced her hand open and held it in his palm, preventing her from suppressing her emotions and stabbing herself with her nails. At the same time, he held her firmly and kept her by his side, not giving her any chance to take risks alone. Even if she died here, she had to die by Li Nanheng's side. The 2 of them bent down and continued to walk in, but the deeper they went, the more the smoke choked their eyes. Even though the gas and fire masks were very effective, they still inhaled some. The rescue operations that Feng Ling had participated in before were not as large as the jungle, and she could accurately know the target location. Chapter 1257. Right now, they didn't even know where they were. How could they find a target location? In such a large jungle, they could hide in any corner, but in such a sea of fire, where could they hide? The 2 of them gradually separated from the firefighters and kept walking forward because their home was there. The road in the middle of the jungle was particularly rugged. It was so rugged that even though they had walked it for half a year, they still felt scared when they stepped on it again. The sea of fire spread, and the choking smoke was nearby. A cluster of fire lifted her clothes. Although the fireproof suit would not burn, it was really hot. Can we still hold on? No matter how they walked in, they were still very far away from their usual living area. The fire was too big. It was not practical to walk in that direction with such a big fire. They would definitely die here before they reached their destination. Feng Ling nodded hastily and did not say much. Li Nanheng exerted a little force and forced Feng Ling to stop. At the same time, he turned around to block her. He lowered his head and saw that the little woman did not seem to realize that she had stopped. She was still walking forward mechanically. She only had to stop because she bumped into his arms. Focus. Don't think about unrelated things. The house can be built again. Let's change the route. They don't know where we built the house. Under normal circumstances, which direction will people go first when they enter the jungle for the first time? Which side looks more obvious? I remember there's a small path near that side. Li Nanheng pressed her into his arms, coaxing her while trying to distract her. Feng Ling came back to herself. She had come in to find Qin Xiu and the others. Of course, saving them was more important. However, after walking in and watching the jungle gradually being swallowed by the sea of fire, she subconsciously wanted to go back and take a look. She didn't know what the emotions in her heart were, but her trembling heart was because when she looked at the trees that were swallowed by the fire, she thought of the home she and Li Nanheng lived together, the home he helped her build bit by bit. She was very sad, but it was not the time to be sad. She braced herself and nodded, trying to sound as calm as possible. Yes, there's a high possibility that the road over there is the same. If they were Feng Ling's parents and this was the first time they had come to a place like the jungle and learned that it was impossible to drive inside, but they also knew that Feng Ling seemed to live here, what would they do? Of course, after walking in, he would find the path that looked the most like a road. Then, he would continue to search for every place that looked beautiful and safe, connecting one safe direction after another. Li Nanheng decisively led Feng Ling there. He no longer hesitated or searched around randomly. He took the same path back and walked toward the route he had roughly guessed. In this thick smoke and terrifying sea of fire, he finally saw the unconscious Mr. Feng Yuanqing, under a tree. Finally, she saw someone. When Feng Ling saw the person who had fallen to the ground, she thought it was Qin Xiu. She endured the scorching heat and the sweat on her body and rushed over. In the end, she turned the person over and saw that it was a man. She had rushed over in a hurry and hadn't seen his silhouette clearly. When she saw that it was a man, she paused. At this moment, Li Nanheng walked over and whispered, "Since Mr. Feng is here, it means that Madame Feng should be nearby. The husband and wife should avoid the fire and walk around here. They won't be too far apart." Hearing that this person was Mr. Feng, Feng Ling composed herself and glanced at the middle-aged man who had fainted from the thick smoke on the ground. Li Nanheng stepped forward and helped the man up. He grabbed one of the man's hands and placed it on his shoulder, helping him to stand up. However, Mr. Feng had clearly fallen into a deep coma and was unconscious. He did not notice this little movement at all. He did not even have the slightest reaction. Li Nanheng knew very well that they were surrounded by trees. It was easy to ignite and produce a lot of thick smoke. He and Feng Ling, wearing heat-resistant suits and gas masks, were already very uncomfortable after coming in for less than 10 minutes, not to mention how much smoke Mr. Feng and Madame Feng had inhaled. Usually, in a fire, the fire was not fatal. The smoke was the real source of death. After Feng Ling finally found one of them, her mental state improved slightly. However, because the smoke here was too thick, she did not have any hope of seeing if Madame Feng could make it out alive. Based on the situation here, any rational person would be able to guess that even if the two of them were brought out, there was almost no hope of them surviving. She quickly looked around. The thick smoke affected her vision. Feng Ling narrowed her eyes and walked a little faster. She continued forward until she saw Madame Feng, Qin Xiu, who had fallen under the tree about 10 meters away. Her heart pounded hard and she quickly ran over to help Qin Xiu up. Madame Feng and Mr. Feng were in the same situation. They were unconscious. Time could not be delayed any longer. Feng Ling did not hesitate to carry Qin Xiu on her back. She supported her body with one hand and decisively took off the mask on her face with the other. She was about to put it on Qin Xiu's face. Li Nanheng turned back and saw her action. His cold brows furrowed. "Do you want to die?" Feng Ling did not answer. She just glanced at him and did not speak. She carried him on her back and walked out. Li Nanheng saw that she was feeling uncomfortable and guessed that nothing he said would make sense, so he did not stop her from doing such a stupid thing. Instead, he raised his hand to take off the mask on his face and walked over to put it on for her. When Feng Ling looked up at him and wanted to ask him what to do, she saw the anger in the man's eyes and was speechless. "Don't waste time. Let's go," Li Nanheng ordered coldly. He carried the middle-aged man who had been leaning weakly by his side and quickly carried him out with Feng Ling. They rushed out along the road under the sea of fire. From time to time, there was the sound of a tree being burned and falling. The journey that should have taken more than 10 minutes was completed in 5 minutes. They had been in there for so long that 11 Base's rescue helicopter had already arrived. Ignoring the objections of the firefighters, they were about to rush in to find them. A group of people was in a stalemate outside the jungle. Suddenly, they saw 2 people rushing out of the sea, each carrying a person. Seeing the 2 figures rushing out under the flames, the members of 11 Base were used to this kind of scene. They were the first to react and hurriedly went up to help. The firefighters looked at the 2 people who rushed out in shock and disbelief. Then they looked at the entire jungle that had been burned and felt incredulous. Chapter 1258. Feng Ling carried Qin Xiu on her back and ran out. The moment the rescue team of 11 Base rushed over, she saw that it was her own people. Her legs turned to jelly, and she staggered, almost kneeling on the ground. The rescue team members stepped forward to support her. Feng Ling. They hadn't seen each other for several months, but they didn't ask much. They just helped her up and quickly took the unconscious Qin Xiu over. The smoke inside is so heavy. Why did you and boss take off the things on your heads? It's okay. Just now, Li Nanheng had put it on for her, but she was in a hurry and didn't put it on properly. She still inhaled some smoke. She gasped uncomfortably and glanced at them. Then she looked at Qin Xiu, who had been quickly helped into the helicopter. She turned around and saw that Mr. Feng had also been sent into the helicopter by Li Nanheng. The firefighters also rushed over to cooperate. After confirming that there was no one else in the jungle, they began to carry out the emergency rescue work. However, the fire was too big. It was not easy to put out the fire. This matter was not under the control of 11 Base. Right now, the most important thing was to save lives. After receiving Boss Li's instructions, the members of 11 Base directly brought the 2 elders in the fire truck to another helicopter and drove the helicopter to the hospital without delay. Feng Ling boarded Li Nanheng's helicopter. Mrs. Feng and Mr. Feng were unconscious in the helicopter. Their faces were in a mess. She didn't dare to check their breathing, but when she carried Qin Xiu out, she didn't seem to feel Qin Xiu's breath. It was so thick smoke. This kind of situation was not something that could be explained by external or internal injuries. In such a big fire, with such thick smoke, even a short 5 minutes was enough to be fatal. When she carried him out, she tried her best to adjust her breathing rate so that she would not choke on the smoke, but at this moment, she felt that her lungs were hurting terribly, and her throat felt like it was being pricked by countless needles. If it was just a bloody wound, everything would be fine. If they were pushed into the emergency room, there might be a good chance of survival. But in this situation, seeing the couple lying there silently and the base doctor opening their eyelids to check their condition, and seeing the base doctor frowning, her heart sank to the bottom. Her hands suddenly felt heavy. Li Nanheng had already taken off his heat insulation suit, sat beside her, and held her hand tightly and heavily. Don't worry. The man's throat was also a little hoarse, but it was clear that he was in a much better state than her. He looked at her with heartache and worry in his eyes, and the other half was because he had to take charge of the overall situation for her under such circumstances. Feng Ling didn't say anything. She didn't know how pale her face was right now. She had some gastrointestinal problems since last night. Although the nausea and vomiting were gone, the discomfort in her stomach still existed. After such a stimulation and torment, she felt as though her entire stomach had turned over. Looking at Qin Xiu and Mr. Feng lying there motionless and silent, her heart also turned over. It was as though her internal organs were hurting. However, in the end, she didn't say anything. She unzipped her heat insulation suit with one hand and let out a long breath. She took off the heat insulation suit that had completely wrapped around her and threw it to the side. Her shoulder-length hair was wet with sweat and stuck to her cheeks and neck. Her body was also covered in sweat. She didn't know if she saw wrongly or if there was an airflow, but the plane was a little bumpy. She seemed to vaguely see the base doctor shaking his head gently after the examination. His eyes were filled with helplessness. Fong Ling's gaze swept past the base doctor's face and then landed on the couple. Her hands were almost instantly cold. Li Nanheng held her tightly and raised his hand to hold her in his arms. "They're all fine here. Don't worry, they'll be fine. If you feel uncomfortable, close your eyes for a while. When we arrive at the hospital, we'll send them to the emergency room immediately. Don't be afraid." Fong Ling closed her eyes and leaned into his arms. In the end, she allowed the discomfort and exhaustion to surround her. Her lips moved. Her voice was too hoarse and low. "It's all my fault." "Blame you for what?" When Li Nanheng heard these words, he instantly frowned and gripped her shoulder tightly. "Don't let your imagination run wild. What does this have to do with you? In fact, we should have left long ago. I was the one who couldn't bear to leave. There were clearly so many responsibilities waiting for us, but I hid in a secluded world and selfishly enjoyed so many stolen days. If I could go back earlier, perhaps they wouldn't come looking for me." "Perhaps they wouldn't." Fong Ling, Li Nanheng held her firmly in his arms. "You know very well that this kind of thing has nothing to do with you. Don't rush to take the blame when something happens. The cause of the fire is still unclear. It's still unclear what happened to Mr. Fong and Mrs. Fong after they entered the jungle. If you continue to be so negative, I'm afraid I'll bring you back to the base. I won't even let you go to the hospital. You won't be able to see the Fong family again." Fong Ling did not speak anymore. She just closed her eyes and leaned weakly in his arms. After a long time, just when Li Nanheng thought that she was so tired that she fell asleep in his arms, he suddenly heard a low sob. Fong Ling was crying. However, she was afraid that someone would find out that she was crying, so she could only hide in his arms, but she still couldn't help but make a little sound. Li Nanheng did not speak. He hugged her and gently stroked the back of her head as though he was coaxing an injured little beast. He lowered his head and kissed the hair on her head to comfort her. At the same time, he turned to look at the doctor. The doctor saw that Fong Ling did not look at them and turned to meet Li Nanheng's gaze. He sighed imperceptibly and then gently shook his head. There was nothing he could do. The cabin was very quiet, and no one spoke. If one listened carefully, they could only vaguely hear Fong Ling's low sobs, but she really tried her best to suppress it and hide her voice. Her face was buried in his arms, and her hands were also tightly gripping his clothes. Her fingers were still tightly clenched, and there was the sound of bones crisscrossing. In all these years, the number of times Fong Ling had cried could be counted with 5 fingers, not to mention in front of so many members of the base. Li Nanheng glanced at the couple again, and his eyes darkened. He abruptly picked up Fong Ling, who was sobbing softly in his arms, and carried her into the bathroom in the helicopter. Chapter 1259. In the bathroom on the helicopter, there were all the things and facilities. The space was not big, but it was very quiet. After closing the door, it could isolate all the gazes from the outside. He gave her a quiet space to cry and let her vent. However, after entering the bathroom, Fong Ling just stuck in his arms and refused to raise her head. Li Nanheng locked the bathroom door, pressed her against the door, lowered his eyes to look at her, and forced her chin up to stare at her red eyes. "Don't hide. If your heart is too uncomfortable, cry. After all, we've already rescued her, haven't we? The damage has been minimized, and the rest will be left to the doctor. You didn't do anything wrong. That jungle was the place where you lived when you were very, very young. You should be glad that your parents wanted to come here personally to take you back. They have seen the place where you lived when you were young. They really love you and miss you very much." Fong Ling could no longer hold back her tears. She raised her red eyes to look at him and suddenly burst into tears. She threw herself into the man's arms and sobbed hoarsely. "Li Nanheng, I'm afraid." From the first day she could remember, she stood in the jungle to survive, and then for so many years, until today. This was the first time she said she was afraid. Li Nanheng hugged her and let her cry to her heart's content in the bathroom. In the end, when she was tired of crying and her stomach was uncomfortable, she leaned weakly in his arms and did not make a sound. After confirming that she had stopped crying, he opened the bathroom door and let her out. At this time, the helicopter had already flown over a large hospital that cooperated with 11 Base and was about to land. Feng Ling's eyes were already red from crying. The base members on the plane saw that she was actually crying. Recalling the scene where Feng Ling and Boss Li risked their lives to save her from the sea of fire, although they didn't know what relationship the Feng family had with them, their relationship shouldn't be simple. Considering that Feng Ling was also surnamed Feng, the base members didn't dare to ask more. However, after the plane landed, considering that the wind outside was too strong and Feng Ling's eyes were rarely so red, one of the members handed her a pair of sunglasses. "Thank you, I don't need it." Feng Ling didn't mind her eyes were red. "Put it on. The wind is strong. You just cried, and your eyes can't stand the stimulation." Li Nanheng took it for her and put the sunglasses on for her. He really couldn't bear to see her crying. Earlier in the bathroom, his heart ached so much that he wanted to dig out his heart. Right now, there were still a lot of things waiting for them to deal with outside. There were also Mrs. Feng and Mr. Feng's lives waiting for emergency treatment. He needed to calm down and rationally deal with it, but as long as he saw her swollen eyes from crying, he was afraid he wouldn't be able to remain 100% calm. Feng Ling did not resist. She thought of the two elders of the Feng family in the other helicopter. At this time, they must be more worried. If they saw her crying like this, the two elders would probably not be able to control their emotions. The old man was old and could not take too much stimulation. The plane landed smoothly. The base members quickly sent Mr. Feng and Mrs. Feng to the hospital emergency center. Feng Ling got off the plane and was about to follow them when she suddenly heard the door of another plane that had just landed open. Someone was reminding the two elders of the Feng family to be careful not to fall. She stopped in her tracks and turned back to see the two elders. She saw that they were trembling and eager to get off the plane. Li Nanheng was going to the emergency center to dispatch people. There were many things he needed to do. He patted Feng Ling's shoulder. "Go accompany the two elders first. Leave the rest to me. I'll investigate the cause of the fire as soon as possible. Be obedient and go." Feng Ling stood in place. Seeing that Li Nanheng had already entered the emergency center, she gently exhaled, then turned to the helicopter, and went up to help. Grandfather Feng and Grandmother Feng were as anxious as ants on a hot pan. They were anxious to enter the emergency center to check on the situation. When she suddenly saw Feng Ling, Grandmother Feng's tears, which she had held back all the way, fell again. When Feng Ling reached out to support her, she quickly grabbed her hand tightly. "Feng Ling. Feng Ling, my good granddaughter, there was no need for a blood test or any other verification." When she saw her outside the jungle, she was sure that this was really that child, the pitiful child of the Feng family who had been lost in the vast ocean at the age of 1. She doted on her the most. Feng Ling's face was somewhat similar to Qin Qiu's, but her features were very similar to her father's. Her entire body was filled with the shadow of the Feng family. It couldn't be wrong. In the eyes of outsiders, she still looked cold and unapproachable. However, after her hand was tightly grabbed by the old lady, she did not move away. She only supported her and nodded at Grandfather Feng, who was walking over. She said softly to them, "I've already sent him to the emergency room. I'll accompany you to the emergency center to find a rest room. Earlier, I choked on a lot of smoke and was tossed around all the way. Even young people can't take it, let alone you two. Go rest first. We'll be here. Don't worry." Grandfather Feng nodded and said softly, "I've already sent him to the emergency room." Grandmother Feng cried and nodded. "Child, you know who we are, don't you? You know where you're. Let's wait for news from the emergency room." Although Feng Ling knew that they were her family and that the people in front of her loved and missed her grandparents, now was not the time to acknowledge them. Besides, she didn't know how to deal with such feelings. She interrupted her softly. Her sunglasses covered all the true emotions in her eyes. She only called the members of the base in the helicopter to help her help the two elders of the Feng family in. Even though Feng Ling looked indifferent and unapproachable, at least she did not let go of Grandmother Feng's hand. When she sent them to the rest room, she said that she would pour them 2 glasses of water. Grandmother Feng could see that her entire body was tense. Even though she was reluctant, she still let go of her hand. Feng Ling asked someone to accompany them here. She then turned around and went out. She found 2 disposable cups to fill with warm water. When she returned with the water, she was still thinking about the jungle that had been swallowed by the sea of fire. The home she and Li Nanheng had built with their own hands would definitely not be able to return. Thankfully, all the memories were warm and happy. Thankfully, neither of them was injured. As he said, the home could be rebuilt if it was destroyed. Life was more important. So how did the fire start? She remembered that before she left, she had extinguished all the fire sources. She was afraid that it would cause a fire in the jungle. Fire prevention was very important. She had been very careful, so it was impossible for it to have spontaneously ignited from the inside. There must be some external factor. Chapter 1260. But what kind of external factors was it? There was no one nearby, and there were signs prohibiting tourists from approaching. She knew that there was no one to control the jungle and that it was not safe, so no one dared to go near it. It had caused such a serious fire so quickly. She had every reason to suspect that someone had set the fire on purpose. But there weren't even any surveillance cameras nearby. Walking back to the lounge, Feng Ling put down the 2 glasses of water. In fact, she didn't know how to comfort the old couple, but they had clearly been through a lot. At first, their emotions were indeed unstable, anxious, and excited, but now they had calmed down. Grandfather Feng sat on the chair in the lounge and sighed softly. From time to time, he asked the base members who were guarding them. He was concerned about the situation in the emergency room and wanted to know how serious the discipline of his son and daughter-in-law was. The base members didn't know this probability. They only knew that the survival rate was very low. At this time, they couldn't be provoked, so they could only answer that they didn't know. Old Madame Feng sat there, her eyes still red. When she saw Feng Ling return, she turned to look at her. When Feng Ling went to fetch the water, she turned on the tap and washed her face and eyes with cold water. Although her eyes were still slightly swollen, it was not too obvious. She had already taken off her sunglasses. Meeting old Madame Feng's gaze, she gently placed the disposable paper cup filled with warm water in her hand. Drink some water first. Calm down. Old Madame Feng looked at her with mixed emotions. She wanted to say something. The whole family drove to the jungle because they heard that Feng Ling seemed to have lived there when she was young. When she heard this news, her heart ached uncontrollably. She really wanted to bring the child back to dote on her, but she didn't expect to encounter such a thing. Right now, she was looking at such a living granddaughter standing in front of her. Her features were delicate and her personality was steady and dignified. Even though she did not receive higher education from the Feng family, she was clearly a very outstanding and sensible child. She was many times more mature than those spoiled rich young ladies raised in wealthy families. She clearly had a lot to say, but when she saw her, she couldn't say a word. She held the cup in one hand and held Feng Ling's hand with the other, unwilling to let go. She said warmly, "Child, the Feng family has let you down." Feng Ling was startled for a moment. She then smiled lightly at the old lady. "No, now is not the time to talk about this. Please relax." Seeing that she was so sensible, old Madame Feng felt even worse. She put down the cup and held her hand. "Can you let me hug you well?" Grandma, just want to hug you. I know you're worried about your parents. You look sensible. Your grandfather and I are also worried about them, but you're the child we've lost for 20 years. Right now, I just want to hug you properly. Fong Ling stood by her side and didn't speak. She looked at her with a pained expression. Grandma, just want to hug you. Fong Ling looked at her and nodded slightly. Old Madame Fong instantly choked up. She resisted the urge to cry and hugged Fong Ling. Although old Madame Fong was old, she was a very famous model in the American Chinese world when she was young. Her height shrank as she grew older, but she was not short. In front of Fong Ling, she could hold the thin Fong Ling in her arms and hug her like an elder protecting a child. In her 21 years of life, this was the first time she felt the embrace of a family member. And it was her own grandmother. Fong Ling had never resisted the Fong family, but she was not used to it. She didn't know how to face those people who were related to her by blood, so she didn't want to acknowledge them. However, at this moment, being hugged so tightly by her grandmother, a great sadness finally surrounded her. It was as though she was a child who was aggrieved and wanted to cry in her grandmother's arms. Her nose turned sour, but she held it in. She obediently allowed her to hug her. Hearing that Grandfather Fong was also walking over agitatedly, she did not push him away. Child, you've been wronged. Grandfather Fong stood by the side and wanted to hug her, but seeing that his wife was reluctant to let go, he could only stand by the side and smile in relief. If it weren't for the fact that his son and daughter-in-law were still in the emergency room, his laughter would have been even brighter. He looked at Fong Ling. How exactly did you live in that jungle? We've asked many people, but not many people know what you've experienced. Even if we know, we only know a little, but just that little is enough to make our hearts ache. You've really suffered too much. In the future, come back to the Fong family with us. We'll definitely do our best to make up for everything you've lost in the past 20 years. We love you very much and miss you very much. You're our Fong family's flesh and blood, our little granddaughter. Grandfather Fong stood by the side and wanted to hug her, but seeing that his wife was reluctant to let go, he could only stand by the side and smile in relief. Perhaps it was because she had just let go of her emotions and cried in front of Li Nanheng, so the defenses in her heart were not so heavy. Or perhaps it was because her grandparents' true feelings touched her. Fong Ling couldn't hold back her sour nose and tears fell out. She didn't like to cry. She had never thought that people would really cry when they were emotionally touched. She had only told Li Nanheng about her experiences in her life. At that time, she did not say it in detail, but Li Nanheng could tell what her childhood was like from her life and habits. He had even accompanied her to live in the jungle for so long. In this world, it was enough for only Li Nanheng to know her experiences. She didn't want to be the kind of person who would show others the wounds that had long healed, so she didn't follow Grandfather Feng's words. Instead, she raised her hand and gently patted Grandmother Feng's back. She said softly, "I'm right here. I won't be lost again. You too should rest well." Grandfather Feng's eyes instantly turned red when he heard the words "won't be lost again." Grandmother Feng hugged her even tighter. At this moment, there was the sound of the base members greeting him respectfully. Then Li Nanheng appeared in front of the lounge. The man's gaze was solemn and indifferent as he looked at the two elders of the Feng family. He nodded politely at Grandfather Feng and glanced at the figure being held by the old lady. His voice was so serious that it made Fong Ling shiver. "Fong Ling, come out." Fong Ling patted the old lady's back again. She turned around and saw the man's solemn expression. Ching Ching has finally opened a reader group after more than a year of cheering from the readers. Ha ha ha, and it's a WeChat group. If you want to join, go take a look on Weibo and send me a private message to take a screenshot of my fan value. Chapter 1261. What's wrong? Fong Ling walked out of the lounge and looked up at him. Li Nanheng lowered his eyes to look at her, raised his hand, and gently rubbed her soft hair. He seemed to be very tired. This kind of exhaustion was not physical, but psychological. Touching her hair and seeing the hope in her eyes, he said in a low voice, "they are not in good condition. You have to be mentally prepared." Fong Ling knew that they had inhaled too much smoke and had been in the jungle with a huge fire for so long. When she carried Mrs. Fong on her back, she could not feel her breath. She was indeed mentally prepared, but she habitually trusted Li Nanheng. He told her not to worry and to leave everything to him. But Li Nanheng was not an immortal. He could not bring a dying person back to life. That tiny bit of hope was shattered in the end. Fong Ling did not speak but just pursed her lips and looked at him. Li Nanheng couldn't stand her silent and forbearing gaze. He glanced at the two old people who were still in the lounge, and an imperceptible heartache flashed across his eyes. He dragged her away and pressed her against the wall in a corridor that the two old people couldn't see. "There's still an emergency treatment, but the doctors are basically dealing with the aftermath. I know you can't bear it, but I can't hide it from you." Fong Ling was speechless. Indeed, she thought she was strong enough. But when this kind of thing really happened, she found that she really couldn't take it. Leaning against the wall, she felt speechless. In her mind, Mrs. Fong, Qin Xiu, looked at her excitedly and patiently in the shopping mall. She looked at her eagerly in the coffee shop. She smiled gently from time to time because of her and Li Nanheng's ambiguous love in the coffee shop. She had a mother and a father. They personally went to the jungle to pick her up and take her home. She thought that she had never come into contact with family since she was young and thought that she was indifferent to it, but she did not expect that such a strong blow would make her entire body numb. Fong Ling leaned against the wall and did not speak. Li Nanheng stood in front of her, holding her shoulder, giving her time to be silent, giving her time to digest and face, and accompanying her in silence. In the end, Fong Ling reached out to hug his neck and buried her face in his neck. She did not speak, but he felt the warm tears on his neck. He caressed her head. "My parents passed away when I was very young. I was too young at that time, and I didn't even have the emotions to cry or be sad. After living with a few elders, I've become numb to family love, but I can't deny its existence. When I'm sad, I cry. It takes time to heal. I've always been here. I have shoulders and chests. They're all yours." Fong Ling hugged him and nodded silently. Her tears still soaked his neck. He gently stroked the back of her head and held her firmly in his arms. "Little Chiu. How could this be? How could this be?" Just as Fong Ling was comforted by Li Nanheng and the two of them were walking back, they suddenly heard a trembling scream. The voice belonged to old Madame Fong. Fong Ling's expression stiffened and she quickly walked over, only to see that old Madame Fong had already walked out. Not far away, the door of the emergency room was open. Qin Xiu's entire body and face were covered by a white cloth. The doctor had just informed the people of 11 Base and then pushed her out. She didn't expect there to be two old people here. As soon as she was pushed out, she was stopped and couldn't be pushed to the morgue. She could only stand there and watch the old people crying and pouncing on her. She had just learned that there was no hope. Now that she saw the person who was once smiling at her lying under a cold white cloth, Fong Ling's face instantly turned pale. She quickly walked over and when old Madame Fong lifted the white cloth and threw herself on the bed to hug Qin Xiu, she walked forward and hugged old Madame Fong. She couldn't say anything. When she opened her mouth, she would definitely be choked with sobs. She tried her best to hold back all the tears that wanted to gush out, but she looked at the pale and motionless Qin Xiu with her own eyes. She saw that the tears had already dried up. They were probably shed in the emergency room, but in the end, she couldn't be saved. Even if no one was willing to believe that all of this was true, the whole family had been discussing how to bring her back last night. The whole family had been very happy and excited, but why did they suddenly separate forever? It would only take a few hours. It was just a big fire. His body was not burnt at all. Everything was clean and tidy. But she was gone. The old lady threw herself on Qin Xiu's cold body and cried. She kept shouting, "Xiao Qiu, don't go." Feng Ling just came back. You two haven't acknowledged each other yet, Xiao Qiu. These words all hit Feng Ling's heart. Feng Ling had just cried. Right now, she was holding back her tears. She hugged the old lady tightly with both hands, afraid that she would fall down. Grandfather Feng stood by the side and closed his eyes. His painful gaze shifted from Qin Xiu's pale face and finally landed on the medical staff at the end of the bed. Even though he knew that there was little hope, he still asked hoarsely, "What about the other one?" "My son, sir, the man inside is the same," the leading doctor said apologetically. He and his wife also inhaled a lot of smoke. No matter how advanced modern medicine is, it's really impossible to save this situation. However, the man's physical fitness is slightly stronger than his wife's. He barely regained some consciousness before, and now he's still breathing. Maybe he can see him for the last time. The doctor tried his best to be tactful. However, it was clear that he was saying that this was the last time he would see him before he completely died. There was no way to save him. When Grandfather Feng heard that his son could not be saved, he almost staggered. The members of 11 Base behind him quickly stepped forward to support him. "Elder Feng, my condolences." At this moment, the doctor suddenly looked at Li Nanheng, who had just walked behind Feng Ling and the old lady. "Mr. Li, the man inside is still dying, but we heard what he said during the emergency treatment. He said he wanted to see you." "See him?" He was about to die, and his daughter and family were outside. However, when Mr. Feng knew that he only had one breath left, he said he wanted to see Li Nanheng. Li Nanheng glanced at the doctor indifferently. The doctor nodded at him, indicating that what he said was true. At this time, the old lady had already fainted from crying. Feng Ling quickly helped her up, and Grandfather Feng could only rely on others to support him. The scene was chaotic. The doctor was already used to this situation and only told the patient's last words truthfully. W. 4M. Chapter 1262. Li Nanheng gave the members of 11 Base a look. They immediately understood what their boss meant and nodded. "We'll make arrangements for the two elders of the Feng family." Li Nanheng did not speak further. At the same time, his gaze landed on Feng Ling. She was hugging Madame Feng. Under the doctor's lead, he walked into the emergency room. After changing into a sterilized isolation suit, he walked in and walked to the bed inside. Mr. Feng was lying there with his eyes closed, motionless. Li Nanheng looked at the various medical equipment by the side. He heard the sounds of the heart and lungs breathing and all the machines that represented the human body's vitality. He saw Mr. Feng's weak breathing and the frequency of his heart that was about to stop beating. He walked to the bedside. "Sir, Mr. Li is here. Can you still hear me?" The doctor walked over and removed the blood pressure measurement from Mr. Feng's fingertips. This thing was no longer of any use to him, but when it was removed, the other party would more or less feel it. After a long minute, Mr. Feng's eyelids moved slightly. His fingers also moved slightly. He could not open his eyes, but he moved his lips with great difficulty. Li Nanheng looked at him. A moment later, he leaned down and pressed his lips against his lips. He heard him say 2 words in a barely audible voice. He spoke with great difficulty and could hardly be heard clearly, but the emergency room was very quiet. Li Nanheng listened quietly. After a while, he finally finished listening to Mr. Feng's words, and his eyes were as deep as the sea. Then, a long beep came from the medical equipment by the side. When Mr. Feng was pushed out with a white cloth, the 2 elders of the Feng family had already been helped back to the break room by the people of 11 Base. Only Feng Ling stood outside the emergency room and watched him walk out. Feng Ling stood there quietly. When she watched Mr. Feng being pushed out with a white cloth, her gaze lingered on the person on the bed for a long time until Li Nanheng asked her, "Do you want to see your biological father?" Feng Ling raised her hand. She wanted to lift the white cloth, but in the end, she only hung in the air and gently clenched her fist. No, he's already gone. Let him rest in peace. Hearing her words, the doctor continued to push her towards the elevator to send her to the morgue. When all the medical staff had left, the corridor outside the emergency room was so quiet that even the sound of a pin dropping could be heard. Li Nanheng still stood there watching her. Feng Ling did not leave either. She just looked back at the man. What did he say to you? Li Nanheng did not answer. He walked up to her, lowered his eyes to look at her for a moment, and then raised his hand to pull her into his arms. Feng Ling knew that her father must have said something to Li Nanheng, but Li Nanheng did not say anything. He only hugged her and kissed her forehead. What do you want to do now? I want to kill someone. Feng Ling answered straightforwardly. The first time I had the urge to kill was when I faced that fat commander at the military base. Then I really killed him. This is the second time. I really want to kill someone. Li Nanheng's hand landed on the back of her head comfortingly and gently stroked it. I understand. She hadn't returned home yet, and she hadn't recognized her relatives yet. Suddenly, she was separated from her parents for 20 years. They only wanted to go to the jungle to pick up their child. Everything should have developed in a good direction, but why did such a fire suddenly happen? Feng Ling closed her eyes. She clenched her fingers so hard that there was a sound of bones crisscrossing. From now on, no matter what I do, don't stop me. Li Nanheng's hand paused on the back of her head, and Feng Ling continued, I won't do anything illegal. A moment later, the man responded in a low voice, N. It was said that the forest fire burned for 2 days and 1 night before the fire was slightly smaller. Only then could the fire trucks successfully approach and gradually put out the remaining fire. The entire jungle had almost been burned to the ground. When they approached, the ground was covered in charcoal and black tree trunks. When the wind blew, the air was filled with the smell of burning. This fire affected the tourism environment near Malibu Beach. The United States Tourism Administration was very angry and reported it to the higher-ups. In less than 48 hours, it had already alarmed the higher-ups. They sent people from all over to investigate the cause of the fire in the jungle and ask questions everywhere. However, that jungle was not a place that anyone could easily approach. There were no surveillance cameras around, so there was no way to investigate. They only knew that the Feng family had appeared there in the end, but Mr. Feng and Mrs. Feng had already died because of this forest fire. The old man and old lady of the Feng family were sent to the hospital's recuperation center to be comforted and cared for by a psychiatrist. Right now, it was not suitable for the police to collect evidence and interview them. Who else was there in the Feng family? Feng Mingzhu. However, from the beginning of the incident until now, Feng Mingzhu had never appeared. Originally, even if someone had considered if it had something to do with Feng Mingzhu, Feng Ling believed that no matter how crazy Feng Mingzhu was, she wouldn't do something like burning her biological parents to death. She was just too extreme and muddle-headed. It was impossible for her to do such a heinous thing. However, for 3 days, Feng Mingzhu did not appear. When they received news from the customs that Feng Mingzhu was in a hurry to leave the United States with someone else's passport and identity card, she was caught by the customs and was currently detained at the airport. After learning that Feng Mingzhu was actually secretly escaping to leave the United States, Feng Ling felt as though she had fallen into an ice cave. Airport, Customs Center. Feng Mingzhu sat on a chair inside. She had no time to look at the luggage by her hand. From time to time, she raised her pale face and panicked eyes to look at the customs staff coming and going. When the people on duty here turned to help carry the luggage, she suddenly stood up and walked in the direction of the bathroom. The customs staff only noticed that her behavior was a little strange, but they did not find out that she had done anything illegal. However, they still investigated her matter out of suspicion and learned that she might be related to the recent incident of the Feng family in the Chinese community of Los Angeles. Thus, they kept an eye on her and called the relevant departments. Afterward, they somehow contacted the people from 11 Base. The higher-ups wanted them to detain this Feng Mingzhu and not let her leave the country. Thus, they were only responsible for watching her. The fake passport and identity card had been left behind, and the real passport had been disqualified from the passport database. Feng Mingzhu had already lost the chance to leave the United States smoothly. The people here were only responsible for checking the luggage. Although there were many people, no security guards were sent over. Feng Mingzhu wanted to take this opportunity to find the right time to escape. W. 4M. Chapter 1263. A figure hurriedly went to the washroom of the Customs Inspection Center and took off his coat. Then, he hurriedly took out a pair of sunglasses from his coat and put them on. He tied his hair up high into a ponytail. His whole appearance and temperament seemed to have changed a little. She wanted to sneak out while the staff of the Customs Center were not paying attention. Feng Mingzhu saw that two people who worked as agents were detained by the customs. Many customs officers went up to forcefully open their suitcases to check their items. When their attention was on the two illegal agents, they didn't care about their suitcases anymore and quickly jumped out of the door by the side. 2 or 3 minutes later, the customs staff suddenly found that Feng Mingzhu had disappeared. They went to the washroom and saw the coat thrown there. They hurriedly came out and sounded the alarm. In the large Los Angeles airport, Feng Mingzhu was hiding everywhere. Suddenly, the entire airport's alarm rang, scaring her to the point where she had nowhere to run. She hid in a deserted corner, trembling all over, and her eyes lost focus as she stared into the distance. Her arms wrapped around her shoulders, she squatted there, buried her face between her legs, and cried silently in fear. The alarm didn't stop. From time to time, the sound of an English broadcast came from the airport, and the entire airport was filled with Feng Mingzhu's name. Feng Mingzhu felt that she couldn't hide here. Sooner or later, she would be discovered by the patrols or security guards here. Taking advantage of the fact that there was no one around, she came out of the corner and wandered around the washrooms. In the end, she wanted to find an opportunity to walk to the exit or the parking lot to leave. However, while Feng Mingzhu was walking quickly to find a way out, she didn't know that all the entrances and exits of the Los Angeles airport, which covered an area of 2.6 million square meters, had been quickly guarded by members of the 11 base. She didn't know that all the visible surveillance areas on every floor of the airport had been thoroughly checked. 15 minutes later, Feng Mingzhu managed to blend into the group of people who had just landed outside the airport hall. From time to time, she pushed up the sunglasses on her face and walked out of the crowd. Just as she was about to walk out of the airport hall, suddenly, a group of people wearing the black uniforms of the 11 base appeared in front of her and surrounded her. As soon as Feng Mingzhu saw their clothes and the cold and solemn expressions on their faces, she trembled and froze in place. In the next moment, she saw the members of the 11 base take the initiative to give way. When she saw the people approaching in front of her step by step, she felt as though the whole world was about to collapse. Feng Mingzhu's expression was ashen. She watched as Feng Ling approached her step by step. Feng Ling's gaze was cold, and there was undisguised coldness and killing intent in her eyes. She stopped 4 or 5 meters away from Feng Mingzhu and looked at her coldly. You. Feng Mingzhu had thought of many possibilities. She thought it was the police or someone else, but she never expected that the person who came to arrest her would be Feng Ling. What about me? Feng Ling looked at her expressionlessly. Her eyes seemed to be covered with a layer of ice. If you didn't escape, I wouldn't have thought that this whole matter would really have something to do with you. The police haven't even found any surveillance cameras near the area, but you've been hiding for so many days. You even want to use a fake identity to leave the United States. Not to mention that it's impossible for you to leave, even if you really leave, as long as 11 base wants to track you down. Where do you think you can escape to? Even if you hide in the South Pole, there's still nowhere to run. Feng Mingzhu's expression was deathly pale. What are you talking about? I just accidentally took the wrong passport. When did I say that I wanted to use a fake identity to leave the country? However, Feng Ling did not wait for her to finish speaking. She only sneered and casually took out the real passport that belonged to Feng Mingzhu from her pocket. When Feng Mingzhu looked at the thing in her hand in disbelief and was speechless, she suddenly threw the passport heavily on her face. Feng Mingzhu was in pain, but she looked at the people from 11 base around her and then at the gun on Feng Ling's waist. Her lips trembled and she could not say a word for a long time. They were clearly sisters, but at this moment, they were actually meeting each other with such identities. Feng Ling looked at her coldly for a long time. It was so long that Feng Mingzhu was about to be frozen under her gaze. Feng Ling asked coldly, "Why did you do this?" Feng Mingzhu closed her eyes. From the moment she learned that her parents had entered the jungle and that they had died in the fire, she knew that she was finished. Originally, she wanted to hide, but now she knew that she had no hope at all. Whether it was Feng Ling, the Feng family, or the police, they would not let her off. It was impossible for her grandparents to protect her. She didn't know why she suddenly walked into a desperate situation. She just wanted to stop Feng Ling from coming back. Feng Mingzhu closed her eyes. It was unknown whether she was crying or smiling. After a long time of tolerance, she suddenly knelt on the ground and cried loudly. She cried until her neck was red and her entire face was red. She cried until she was out of breath and shouted, "I didn't want to kill them. I didn't expect them to go in. Those are my parents. They are my parents. I only want to burn you to death, not them." Feng Ling's hands that were quietly hanging by her legs suddenly clenched into fists. I didn't want to. Feng Mingzhu had completely broken down. "I haven't eaten or slept for days. I just don't want you to go back to the Feng family. Why do you want to live? I just want you to die there. The person I want to burn to death is you. But why are they the ones who die? Why?" She raised her hand and held her head hard, screaming and crying. "I don't want to do this either. Why did they go in? I don't want to kill them at all. But what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? By the time I know, it's already too late." Feng Ling endured and walked forward, kicking Feng Mingzhu's chest hard. She then walked forward and pulled Feng Mingzhu up, who had been kicked to the ground. She grabbed her collar tightly with both hands and looked at her fiercely and coldly. "Feng Mingzhu, you're really stupid. How can I have the same blood as you?" Feng Mingzhu's entire body was in a sorry state. She looked at her with a miserable expression. Feng Ling's kick was very painful, and there seemed to be the taste of blood in her throat. She tried hard to swallow it, but a cold gun was suddenly pressed against her forehead. Feng Mingzhu shivered all over and looked at her with trembling eyes filled with fear. "We're clearly sisters, but there's such a big gap between us. Do you think you're the daughter of a famous family? You've been living a luxurious life since you were young, and I'm an orphan who can't be on your so-called stage." Feng Ling's voice was cold, and she said word by word coldly, "But do you know where the real gap between us is? That is, if you want to kill me, it's still as difficult as ascending to heaven as you plan carefully and advance step by step. And if I want you to die, I can make your blood splatter on the spot right now." Asking for monthly votsu. 4M. Chapter 1264. Feng Ling had already pulled the trigger. As long as she hooked her finger, she could immediately send Feng Mingzhu to meet her parents. Feng Mingzhu's eyes were full of fear. She knew she was doomed. But facing a woman who seemed to be possessed by the king of hell, she really felt a gun pressed against her head. Her head could be blown off at any time, and the fear of death surrounded her. She trembled violently and looked at Feng Ling in disbelief. Are you going to kill people in a place like the airport? Feng Ling, how can you be so bold? If you dare to set fire to the jungle, you should have investigated my childhood. I grew up drinking wolf's milk. How can I be humane? The only reason I've kept you alive until today is because I've never cared about you." Feng Ling's tone was very indifferent, but the gun in her hand was very cold. It was as cold as her voice. You set fire to the forest and killed your parents. The Feng family can no longer be your backer. The police and 11 base won't let you off, especially me. Even if I shoot you here, it's just a matter of writing another complaint. It won't cause any trouble. Do you think I don't dare? After being in contact with Feng Ling for so long, Feng Mingzhu only knew that she seemed to be a very powerful character in 11 base, but Feng Ling had always been very gentle and aloof. She was always indifferent and didn't even have the desire to quarrel with others. This was the first time Feng Mingzhu felt Feng Ling's killing intent. It was a terrible killing intent. You can't kill me. Feng Mingzhu tried to suppress the fear in her eyes and glared at her. I'm your sister, you can't do anything to me. The Feng family is in deep trouble now. If you dare to do anything to me, have you thought about Grandpa and Grandma? Will they be able to take this blow? You. Ah. Before she could finish speaking, she was abruptly slapped to the ground by Feng Ling. The slap was so hard that the corner of Feng Mingzhu's mouth cracked in pain. There was a faint trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. She lay on the ground and only recovered from the dizziness after a long while. She turned her eyes in disbelief and looked at the gun in Feng Ling's hand. The muzzle was still aimed at her, but Feng Ling had already taken a step back and looked down at her expressionlessly. Looking at the black muzzle, Feng Mingzhu shuddered. I do want to kill you, but my parents, who were killed by you, have just found peace in the underworld. They don't seem to want to see you so soon. Feng Ling's voice was cold and indifferent. If I want to take revenge, I have countless ways to make you wish you were dead. Feng Mingzhu, don't stimulate the bloodthirsty and dark side hidden in my bones. Otherwise, I will bite off your flesh bit by bit, cut you into thousands of pieces, and throw you into the deep mountains and wild forests. I will even do things like that. You, Feng Mingzhu didn't expect that she could say such bloody and terrifying words. Her entire face was pale, and her eyes were filled with fear. Feng Ling narrowed her eyes coldly, the muzzle still aimed at her head, and sneered. Do you want me to remind you again? I grew up drinking wolf's milk. Feng Mingzhu trembled under her gaze. From the beginning to now, you're just a prey that can be torn apart at any time in front of me. I don't touch you because you're a member of the Feng family. Secondly, I never thought that a person could be so stupid that she could kill her own parents. If you were smart enough, it would be fine. At least, you wouldn't harm others and yourself, but unfortunately, you're really stupid to the point that you deserve to die. Feng Ling coldly looked at her face that was filled with fear. Feng Mingzhu, do you really want to taste the feeling of being torn apart? I don't. Feng Mingzhu breathed heavily and abruptly tried to get up from the ground. However, the moment she got up, she was kicked to the ground by Feng Ling again. Her head hit the empty chair by the side and trembled miserably on the ground for a long time. Then she curled up and leaned against the chair, barely managing to sit up. She looked carefully at the thing in Feng Ling's hand. That gun. Seeing the fear and concern in her eyes, Feng Ling's eyes were still cold. Don't worry, this is a silencer gun. Even if I kill you here, few people will hear it. Feng Mingzhu trembled all over and carefully looked at the expressionless members of 11 base around her. Obviously, if Feng Ling really wanted to kill someone, these people would definitely surround her, and she had no chance of breaking through the encirclement. She shrank her neck and leaned against the ground in a sorry state. Suddenly, there were two muffled sounds in the air. Before Feng Mingzhu could react, she saw two dazzling sparks coming out of the muzzle of the gun in Feng Ling's hand. She was so frightened that her heart was in her throat, and her whole body trembled violently. However, the two bullets that came out of the silencer only hit the seat behind her. The shooting was so accurate that it only hit the metal backrest behind the seat and did not damage the seat. The bullets hit the metal backrest and bounced back, directly hitting Feng Mingzhu's shoulder. It was so painful that even though her shoulder was not hit by the bullets, it still hurt. How do you want to die? Feng Ling's voice was indifferent, and her eyes were cold as she looked at her. She just stood there, looking down at her, and she had no intention of putting the silencer gun back. Feng Mingzhu's face was deathly pale. She wanted to hold the back of the chair behind her to stand up, but after trying for a long time, she couldn't get up. She stared blankly at Feng Ling. It wasn't easy for her to prop her legs up, but this time, Feng Ling shot the ground under her feet. Ah! She was so frightened that she fell heavily back to the ground. She felt that the bullet was close to her feet. If she dared to move again, her bullet would definitely hit her. Feng Ling, what exactly do you want? Feng Mingzhu sat stiffly on the ground for a long time, and in the end, she seemed to be about to be driven crazy. She looked at her blankly. What? He didn't even plan on going back to acknowledge his parents. Now, he was going to avenge his parents with righteous indignation? What right do you have to avenge them? Who do you think you are? Do you think I'm really afraid of you? Ah. Another shot. This time, it brushed past her ear, accurately brushing past her earlobe, leaving behind a scorched trail of blood. The bullet once again landed on the back of the metal chair behind her, making a crisp, dang sound. Feng Mingzhu was so shocked that she swallowed back all the words she was about to say due to the shock. Chapter 1265. Feng Ling really wanted to take her life just like that. She really couldn't bear to see her like this. At the thought of the fire in the Malibu jungle and Qin Xiu, who was pushed out of the emergency room with a white cloth, she wished she could kill her on the spot. After several consecutive mental tortures, Feng Mingzhu, who had already broken down, burst into tears. She clutched her clothes tightly with both hands, but her eyes were filled with fear. She didn't even have the strength to get up. Feng Ling held the gun in her hand tightly and looked at her. Every word was cold and clear. I promised Li Nanheng that I wouldn't do anything illegal and wouldn't let him worry. I won't take your life. Keep it and slowly waste it in the cold prison. Feng Mingzhu trembled and looked at her in disbelief. What are you going to do? There's no death penalty in American law. Feng Ling, if you dare. At this moment, the cold muzzle of the gun was suddenly pressed against her forehead. Feng Ling walked forward, leaned down, and pressed the muzzle against her. She said lightly, there's no death penalty in the law, but I do. Unfortunately, death is too easy. It's better to let you suffer in prison for the rest of your life. I'll let you repent and torture yourself every day and night for killing your parents with your own hands. Feng Mingzhu opened her mouth. You, at this moment, Feng Ling put away the gun and no longer looked at her. She turned around expressionlessly and walked away. After taking a few steps, she said coldly, take her away. Behind her, Feng Mingzhu screamed in horror as she was dragged up by the members of 11 Base. Feng Ling quickly walked out of the airport hall with her hands in her pockets. She had been suppressing her temper that was on the verge of erupting. She was afraid that if she really couldn't control it well, Feng Mingzhu would really die here. She knew very well just how much she wanted to kill Feng Mingzhu right now. She endured it until her hands trembled. She endured it until the tip of her tongue hurt from being bitten by her and the taste of blood spread in her mouth. Only then did she calm down. She put the safety of the gun in her pocket back on to prevent herself or the people accompanying her from accidentally injuring herself or the people accompanying her. Feng Mingzhu was dragged into the car and kept screaming. Feng Ling did not look back. She only looked at the blue sky above the airport highway in the distance. It had been a long time since she had seen the sky like this. In the forest, she had always lived in the shade of the dense forest. Although there were occasional rays of sunlight, it was not much. It had been a long time since she had seen such a clear blue sky. Feng Mingzhu returned to the hospital. As she promised, she only caught Feng Mingzhu back and asked the people of 11 Base to take her to the police station. Feng Mingzhu was now stimulated by the death of her parents and was incoherent, but all the evidence was with her. As long as she handed it over to the police, they would find out what method she used to set fire to the forest so smoothly. However, when she returned to the hospital, there were not many people left in the hospital. The two elders of the Feng family had been traumatized and had been accompanied by a psychiatrist. Mr. Feng and Mrs. Feng were in the morgue. Feng Ling didn't know what else she could do in this place, so after entering the hospital, she did not enter again. Instead, she sat on the bench by the side of the hall on the first floor. Her eyes were lifeless as she sat there motionlessly. Li Nanheng learned that she had returned, but he did not wait for her to go upstairs. Not long after, he learned from the members of the base that she was sitting on the first floor in a daze and walked down. He was walking on the escalator, facing where Feng Ling was sitting. The man walked over step by step. Feng Ling's eyes were indeed looking in that direction, but she seemed to have lost focus as though she hadn't seen anything. Clearly, she had fallen into a kind of self-consciousness. When she vaguely felt a familiar aura, Feng Ling's eyes moved and she recovered some energy. She raised her eyes to meet Li Nanheng's gaze. The man had already walked up to her and looked down at her. "I didn't kill her," Feng Ling said stiffly and mechanically. Li Nanheng reached out and stroked her face. "I know." All the wariness and thorns in her body seemed to be instinctively retracted in front of him. Because of the man's approach, Feng Ling pressed her head against his body and pressed her forehead against his abdomen. She whispered, "I don't know what else I can do. The Feng family is in a mess right now. I didn't want to have anything to do with the people in this family, but I can't control myself now. I really feel terrible." Li Nanheng gently patted her shoulder. "Leave everything to me." Feng Ling pressed her head against his firm abdomen and closed her eyes. She raised her hands and silently hugged him. After a long time, she asked in a low voice, "What should I do next?" She didn't know if her senses were wrong, but she seemed to feel that after a few seconds of silence, Li Nanheng touched her hair. "Let's deal with Mrs. Feng and Mr. Feng's funeral first. After sending them away, I'll tell you what you should do." At this time, Feng Ling trusted Li Nanheng unconditionally. She also believed that everything he did for her was developing in a good direction. She also knew that he would definitely plan a good situation for her. Everything would be arranged according to her. However, her home in the jungle was gone. She hugged him tightly and said in a muffled and hoarse voice, "In the future." Li Nanheng interrupted her and said warmly, "You haven't slept well these days. We'll deal with the funeral tomorrow. Go to sleep first. I'll accompany you." Feng Ling nodded and was about to get up when the man hugged her. Before she could react, he picked her up by the waist. She was startled. The moment the man picked her up, she turned to meet his gaze. She instinctively wrapped her hands around his neck and looked at the man's face and his firm, dark eyes that seemed to be able to cover all pain and suffering for her. At this moment, she suddenly rejoiced that she had held back. She didn't like to cause trouble for Li Nanheng. Even though she knew that even if she really shot Feng Mingzhu at the airport, Li Nanheng still had the ability to protect her. But she didn't want to cause trouble for him. Li Nanheng hoped that everything would be fine for her. He didn't want her to be involved in these troublesome matters. Looking at the man's cold and clean side profile, Feng Ling's fatigue finally surged into her heart. She closed her eyes and leaned against his shoulder, allowing him to carry her to the break room. Chapter 1266. Feng Ling didn't know how to deal with her parents' funeral. After Feng Mingzhu was taken away, she had been in a daze for the past few days. During this period, she had cooperated with the psychiatrist to treat the two elders of the Feng family and had visited them. The two elders were already old. In just a few days, the white-haired people had sent off the black-haired people, and they had become even more haggard. However, when they saw that Feng Ling was still standing here, they felt somewhat relieved. Feng Ling wasn't sure if they knew about Feng Mingzhu. They didn't mention Feng Mingzhu's name, so they should know. If they didn't mention her name, it meant that they didn't want to mention these things anymore. This was a good thing. This was enough to show that the two elders were not stupid people. They knew the truth. Even if she was their own granddaughter, they couldn't protect her after discovering such a thing. In fact, Feng Mingzhu's original intention was to burn Feng Ling to death. This intention was even more chilling. No matter how one looked at it, Feng Mingzhu was completely defeated because of her poor planning and excessive haste. She would never be able to come out again in her lifetime. When the matter with the Feng family came to an end, the member of the base who was in charge of dealing with the jungle returned and brought her a few photos of the scene. Feng Ling looked at the enlarged photos on the screen of her phone and saw that the jungle she had lived in since she was a child had completely turned into a charred ruin. The entire jungle with a radius of thousands of hectares was no longer recognizable. The members of the base took photos of the house and cave where she and Li Nanheng lived. As the house was near the cave, there weren't many trees around. The tall grass had long been cleared because they lived there. There was nothing flammable within a few hundred meters, so only the left corner of the cabin had been burned a little. The originally beautiful cabin had now been completely blackened. The clean, tidy, and lively little yard that she and Li Nanheng had personally built was now completely gone. Even though the house was still there and the outline of the house could still be seen clearly, it could no longer be lived in. The psychiatrist that Li Nanheng had arranged for the two elders of the Feng family accompanied them home. For the time being, he needed to observe them for a period of time. After all, these two elderly people were old and had seen a lot of things. Although it was really painful for the elderly to send off the young, they had recovered well. After a few days of psychological treatment and emotional control, as well as the quiet funeral arrangements, the two elderly people just wanted to go back and rest for a while. Li Nanheng was in charge of the matter. He did not let Feng Ling interfere. After everything was done, Feng Ling stood in front of the hospital door and watched as the two elders of the Feng family were helped into the car. Kay walked behind her. Are you really not going back to the Feng family with them? Feng Ling's family background was not spread in the base, but the people around her had basically learned about it after these days. If the Feng family needs help, I will do my best to help, but there is only 11 base behind me. If there is anything that can be called back, it is only 11 base, Feng Ling said softly as she watched the two old people's car leave. Kay nodded. That's good. You haven't come into contact with outsiders for so many years. In the beginning, we were worried. If you really followed these two elders back to the Feng family to become the daughter of some rich family, that kind of scene really feels very strange, and you definitely won't be used to it. But then again, Boss Li really spoils you enough. He has accompanied you outside for so long. Now you can finally return to the team, right? The group of newbies you trained back then is now quite good. You can go back at any time to continue training the newbies. Anyway, their drill master is temporarily sent by Han Jin. On the other side, Kay was chatting and laughing with Feng Ling, and Feng Ling also responded from time to time. Li Nanheng came back from outside and his gaze fell on Kay. Kay's expression faltered and he quickly took 2 steps back from Feng Ling's side. He then said with a smile, Boss, I'm talking to Feng Ling. I'm afraid that she will go back to the Feng family with us because her heart aches for her grandparents. But I've already gotten the truth out of her. She has no intention of going back at all. Boss, you've been waiting for a long time. Was he trying to trick her? Feng Ling didn't smile much, but hearing Kay's words, she smiled helplessly. Boss knows better than me what I think. Do I need you to trick me? I've never wanted to leave you guys. All right, you are the most loyal to the base. Kay glanced at her. I won't disturb you from showing your loyalty in front of Boss. I'll leave first. When you return to the base, the brothers will give you and Boss a good welcome. Feng Ling nodded. She couldn't go back to the jungle. She had planned to return to the base after winter, but now it was only a few months ahead of schedule, so it was fine. Li Nanheng did not speak, but Feng Ling instinctively felt that he had something to say. After Kay left, she looked up at him. Boss. She had always been embarrassed to call him husband or something. Usually, she would just call him Nanheng. To her, the most intimate and familiar thing was to call him boss. Even in the past 6 months in the jungle, she often called him by his full name or boss. Except when he always forced her to call him husband in bed, Nanheng did not force her to change her way of addressing him. Let's go. Where to? Home. When Feng Ling heard these 2 words, the first thing that came to her mind was the cabin in the jungle that had been blackened to the point where no one could live in it anymore. She dispelled this unrealistic idea and thought of the Feng family. Neither seemed possible, so she didn't understand which home he was talking about. However, what happened recently made her used to listening to his arrangements. She didn't ask much and followed him. She opened the door and was about to sit in the car when she suddenly saw a document bag placed on the passenger seat. She glanced at it, picked it up, and asked him, "What is this?" "It's for you." Li Nanheng didn't look at the document bag in her hand and replied, "Get in the car and go home first. There's no hurry to read it." Feng Ling got into the car and looked at the document bag in her hand. She didn't see any words on it. He said he was not in a hurry to read it, so she didn't look at it and placed it in the box by the car door. Begging for monthly votes. Chapter 1267. Feng Ling didn't know what Li Nanheng was trying to tell her about going home. Recently, because of the Feng family's matter, Feng Ling wasn't mentally exhausted, but her mood was definitely affected. She didn't have the mood to consider many things. Right now, the only reason why she could return to normal was that she had been used to being alone since she was young. Her concept of family affection was very vague. The death of her parents was indeed very sad, but she didn't always put her unhappiness on the surface. A few days ago, when she went to talk to grandmother Feng, she heard that Qin Xiu had long known about her. However, because she could tell that Feng Ling liked freedom and didn't want to return to the Feng family, she respected her choice and didn't disturb her. What kind of gentlewoman was Qin Xiu? Feng Ling was deeply gratified and proud that she had such a mother. Even though they were separated forever, at least her heart was warm. Li Nanheng drove the car to a large supermarket in Los Angeles. Feng Ling didn't understand what he wanted to buy, so she got out of the car and walked in. In the end, the man bought a bunch of ingredients and hot pot seasonings. This scene was very similar to when he helped her cook hot pot at home. Was he planning to accompany her for a while before returning to the base? After all, although every day in the jungle was peaceful and happy, he really could not eat hot pot. Usually, he ate whatever was available. He had almost forgotten the taste of the food outside after a long time. He had gone out to buy something at the last minute that day, but in fact, the taste was very average near the beach. Seeing the seasonings and hot pot ingredients that the man had placed in the shopping cart, Feng Ling subconsciously swallowed and accompanied him to choose various ingredients and vegetables. The 2 of them walked in the supermarket for a long time and bought one thing after another in the car. At first, Feng Ling thought that Li Nanheng planned to stay in the home he mentioned for a while so that she could ease the regret of not being able to return to the jungle, so she wanted to buy more things. However, later, she found that Li Nanheng did not continue to put things in the shopping cart. Instead, he seemed to be delaying for a long time. He walked aimlessly in the supermarket, and time passed bit by bit. Feng Ling asked him if he had anything to buy, but he forgot. What did he want to buy? He then casually picked up a bottle of sesame paste from the supermarket shelf. "I forgot, but I heard that hot pot with this kind of sesame paste is common in China. I can buy it and try it." "All right." Feng Ling checked the things in the shopping cart. "It's almost enough. I've already bought a lot." The man glanced at her and pushed the shopping cart to the cashier. In the end, they did buy a lot of things. There were 2 big bags full. Feng Ling was afraid that the bags would fall out because they were too heavy, so she specially bought 2 more shopping bags. She wanted to help carry them, but Li Nanheng had already picked up the bags and carried them out. She followed behind and watched the man's tall and straight back. She felt that he was going to use this hot pot to fill her to death. Otherwise, why would he buy so many? When you say go home, do you mean go back here? Fong Ling looked at Li Nanheng's apartment in Los Angeles and looked up. She still remembered that on the floor below his apartment, he was the one who bought the apartment for her. She had never lived in her own apartment. Li Nanheng didn't speak but got out of the car and carried the things he had bought in. This man seemed particularly silent today. Fong Ling was about to get out of the car when she suddenly heard him remind her to take out the file in the car. Hearing this, Fong Ling picked up the file, got out of the car, and walked out. When she followed him into the apartment, she saw that the security guards outside were still the same too. In fact, she hadn't been here many times, but the security guards seemed to recognize her. They smiled politely and warmly at her as if asking, "Ah, I haven't seen you for many years. You're finally back?" Fong Ling responded with a faint smile. It was not until Li Nanheng, who had already entered the elevator, urged her to go over that she quickly followed him into the elevator. The two security guards outside the door were surprised by Fong Ling's smile. This young lady who appeared with Mr. Li had short hair. At that time, she was dressed like a little boy and never smiled at strangers. Her face was always cold. But just now, her hair had grown quite a bit. It looked like it was almost the length of her neck. Her hair was soft, and her personality seemed to be much calmer and gentler. She was no longer so cold and distant, and she could even smile at them. In just a few years, the callous young man had transformed into a gentle and peaceful woman. Fong Ling's personality had never changed. It was just that in the past, she was used to hiding herself and didn't like to be close to others. She never smiled at others because she didn't know why she should smile. Was there a need to smile? In the past few years, she had been sharpened and experienced many things. She no longer treated people with the same attitude as before, but she was still the same person in her bones. It was just that she seemed to be a lot gentler. The tomboy who had dressed up as a man back then looked very different from the carefree Fong Ling who had grown a bit of hair. As a result, when the security guard outside the door looked at her with a smile, his eyes seemed to be a little stunned. Fong Ling was thinking in the elevator. At the same time, she was considering if she should find time to trim her hair again. She hadn't cut it in the jungle. Now that it was so long, it seemed like it could be tied up. However, she might need some small clips to clip some stray hair by her ears. Before she could think about it, the elevator stopped. Li Nanheng did not speak and walked out. She quickly followed him with the document in her hand. When the door opened, she walked into the apartment she had lived in when she was recuperating. Looking at the clean interior and the clean indoor slippers in front of the door, she knew that although no one had lived in this apartment for a long time, the auntie must have taken time to clean it. Such cleanliness was indeed in line with Li Nanheng's usual obsession with cleanliness. If his own apartment was covered in dust, he probably wouldn't be able to accompany her to clean the house like he did in the jungle. Li Nanheng put the two shopping bags aside and turned back to see that Fong Ling was still standing at the door. His cold brows moved. "What? Are you used to living in the wooden house and don't dare to enter the apartment outside? Haven't you been here before?" Fong Ling was slightly embarrassed and quickly changed her shoes. As she did so, she said, "I remember that the floor below is the apartment you bought for me. It's been renovated a long time ago, but you probably won't have a chance to live in it. Just leave it for now," the man said lightly and picked up the shopping bag to enter the kitchen. Chapter 1268. If she came here, she would stay with him. She definitely wouldn't have a chance to stay here. Fong Ling saw that he had entered the kitchen and followed him to take a look. She had just moved close to his back when the man pulled her into his arms. He lowered his head and stole a kiss on her lips. He then pressed his lips against her ear and said, "Go wash the fruits and cut some fruits to eat. We'll cook hot pot tonight." Fong Ling instinctively turned her neck to the side because of the man's voice and breath. Li Nanheng looked at her white neck, chuckled, and bit her neck again. She cried out in pain and quickly pushed him away. She wanted to help him, but when they were in the jungle, This man had already developed the habit of taking care of her everywhere. He almost let her idle by the side. Now that he arranged for her to wash the fruit, he was already giving her face. She took out the small bag of fruit from the shopping bag in front of him and went to the side to turn on the tap to wash it. After the sound of water flowing for a while, Feng Ling washed and cut the fruit and placed it on the fruit plate. She then picked up a piece of pineapple with a fork and handed it to Li Nanheng's mouth. Li Nanheng took a bite and, as she expected, frowned. Why is it sour again? How many pineapples aren't sour? As Feng Ling spoke, she picked up a piece of sweet pear and placed it by his mouth. The man lowered his head and was about to eat it, but she suddenly took the pear back and ate it herself. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and glanced at her because of her mischievous actions, but Feng Ling said as she forked other fruits, I won't give you the pear. 2 days ago, I heard Kay and the others say that pears are not suitable for sharing. Then, I'll give you grapes. After stuffing the grapes into the man's mouth, she returned to the living room with the fruit plate in satisfaction. She put down the fruit plate and glanced at the document bag on the coffee table. Remembering that he said it was for her, she was about to pick it up and open it to see what it was. There are clothes you can wear in the closet in the bedroom. Go change into comfortable clothes. The man's voice came from the kitchen. Feng Ling's eyes shifted to the bedroom. She hadn't lived in his apartment for long. Why would there be clothes for her? She subconsciously walked into the bedroom and opened the door of the closet. Sure enough, there were a few women's clothes in her size. They were all new and the tags had not been removed. When did he buy them? It couldn't have been recently. In other words, after she stayed here for a few days, Li Nanheng had specially bought a few new clothes to put here because of all the inconveniences. She was wearing casual clothes in the jungle. These days, because of her parents and the Feng family's second son, she didn't pay much attention to her clothes in the hospital. She needed to change, so Kay and the others brought some clothes from the base that she could wear. However, those straight men didn't know how to search for clothes in her empty room, so they casually picked 2 uniforms and sent them to her. The black combat uniform did look valiant and heroic, but it was inconvenient to wear it at home. Moreover, it was tight-fitting. Feng Ling picked out several new clothes and finally chose the softest and most comfortable short-sleeved t-shirt and sporty light-colored trousers. Because her long hair made the back of her neck itchy, she casually combed her hair back, but she never had anything to tie her hair with. A grown man like Li Nanheng definitely wouldn't have one. A few things she had bought in the supermarket appeared in front of her eyes. Her eyes lit up and she walked out. After going to the kitchen, she rummaged through the shopping bag by Li Nanheng's hand. Sure enough, she found 2 vegetables tied with rubber bands. After removing the rubber bands, she combed her hair back and tied it into a ponytail. However, because it was not long enough, some strands of hair on both sides of her cheeks fell forward and covered her cheeks. Li Nanheng watched her movements and then looked at her hair for a long time. Feng Ling put away the bundle of vegetables she had just untied and took out other things from the shopping bag to help him pack up. She subconsciously looked up at him. What are you looking at? The little woman's hair was half tied behind her head. Because there was hair on both sides of her cheeks, when she raised her head, she shook her head slightly. Her eyes were clear and clean. Li Nanheng's heart softened. He habitually raised his hand to rub her hair, but when he saw the little tail she had tied up, he subconsciously retracted his hand. In the end, his fingers landed on her cheek and helped her tuck the strand of hair behind her ear. Feng Ling blinked and looked at him. My hair is long. It's inconvenient to do anything. Can I cut it tomorrow? She did not say that she was going to cut it but asked for his opinion. After all, she had heard that men usually liked women with long hair. Although she was not used to it, after being in the jungle for so long, her hair had grown to her neck. No matter how unaccustomed she was, she had gradually gotten used to it. She just felt it was inconvenient occasionally. Do whatever you feel comfortable doing. In my eyes, even if you shave your hair like mine, you'll still look good. The man smiled. Feng Ling was coaxed by his words and a smile appeared on her face. There are so many ingredients. How long will it take for you to clean up? You didn't eat much at noon. Don't eat too late at night. I'll clean up with you. The man did not stop her. He glanced at her and curved his lips. You're becoming more and more like a virtuous little wife. I'm letting you enjoy more. Now that you're back, you should be more comfortable. I'm quite comfortable. People can only see many things after experiencing some things, but I'm glad that I've seen through them before I experienced them, Feng Ling said as she picked the vegetables. I've thought about the Feng family. In the future, I'll take some time to visit the two elders and visit my parents' graves regularly, but life has to continue. The only regret is that small wooden cabin, but I always remember what you said. As long as you're there, it's home, so I actually like to do things with you. This way, there's the feeling of two people living together. I feel very satisfied. Feng Ling usually did not speak much. Even when she was in the jungle, she often sat by the side and watched Li Nanheng busy himself. She did not say much, but at that time, the smile in her eyes grew wider and wider. This was the first time she had opened her heart to him and told him what was on her mind. It was also the first time she had talked about so many things in her heart. Chapter 1269. It was rare to hear Feng Ling's heartfelt words. Li Nanheng smiled, wiped his hands clean, and pressed her into his arms. He lowered his head and pressed his forehead against hers. His nose was pressed against hers, and there was only half a finger's distance between their lips, but their breaths were intertwined. So, you love me very, very much now? The man's voice was low and husky, and he kissed her on the lips, taking advantage of her. Feng Ling was just telling him the truth. She didn't know why he was suddenly in heat, and she hadn't washed her hands yet. She quickly stretched out their hands to avoid dirtying his clothes, and then dodged back. Li Nanheng, don't you know shame in your life? I just said a word, and you kissed. However, the man directly pecked her lips again. What are you embarrassed about? I really don't know. I only know that you said you like to do anything with me. You said you liked the feeling of coexisting with me. This is dependence, understand? Feng Ling, the days we spent in the jungle have made you completely accustomed to relying on me. No matter what happens in the future, you have to remember this feeling. No matter where you are, you have to think of me first when you encounter something. I will definitely be worthy of your dependence, En. As he spoke, he kissed the corner of her lips. No matter where you are, I will stand behind you. Where else can I go? Feng Ling didn't understand what he meant. She glared at him and quickly pushed him away. All right, hurry up and wash the vegetables. If you continue to dawdle, you'll probably eat very late tonight. She quickly left the kitchen. Otherwise, this man would probably continue kissing and wasting time. Feng Ling hadn't used her phone for many months. A few days ago, she had just recharged her phone, but she didn't know many people, so she only used text messages to contact a few familiar people. The others were also members of 11 Base. They all knew her situation, so there was no need to respond. By the time she installed a few new mobile apps that had been released in the past 6 months on her phone, the aroma of hot pot seasoning wafted out of the kitchen. After a while, she put down her phone and did not turn on the TV. The days she used to live in the jungle were even quieter than this, but she didn't feel bored at all. She really liked to watch Li Nanheng by the side, just like how Li Nanheng always liked to watch her in the past. Liking someone and loving someone was like this. There was no need to do anything special. As long as he was by your side and you could look at him closely, it was the greatest satisfaction. She ran to the kitchen door and watched Li Nanheng busy helping her prepare the ingredients for the hot pot. She leaned against the door and watched him. Feeling her gaze, Li Nanheng looked back at her. Their eyes met. Even though the kitchen was filled with the smell of the hot pot and steam was rising from the pot, he could see the great satisfaction in Feng Ling's eyes. In fact, Feng Ling was not as cold and unapproachable as she had appeared for many years. She was actually a very simple person. She was so simple that there was no need to specially coax her. She was easily satisfied. Go get the bowls and chopsticks. I'll bring the hot pot out. It'll be ready soon. Li Nanheng gave her a look. All right. Feng Ling cooperatively rushed in to get the cutlery. She quickly walked in and out, placing the cutlery on the dining table one by one. The dinner was very satisfying. This was the first time she had sat at home and eaten so quietly since leaving the jungle. Furthermore, it was the kind of leisurely way where she could take a shower and sleep after eating. Feng Ling was the one eating most of the time. Li Nanheng kept helping her cook the food she liked. After he was done, he put it into the bowl in front of her. Li Nanheng was a man who didn't care about trifles. Furthermore, he exercised a lot and had a good figure. Under normal circumstances, he would eat more than her, and when he ate with her, he would eat a lot. However, today, with the steaming hot pot in front of him, he didn't seem to eat much. Most of the time, he helped her cook all kinds of food. He only occasionally picked up a few chopsticks. Aren't you hungry? Feng Ling asked. She remembered that he hadn't eaten or slept well recently, and he hadn't eaten much today. I'll watch you eat first. I'm not in a hurry. The man continued to help her cook the meat and put it into the bowl in front of her. At this moment, the man's phone rang. After looking at the caller ID, he signaled for her to eat first and got up to answer the phone. Feng Ling ate the meat in her bowl and turned to look at the man who had walked to the window to answer the phone. From the content of the conversation, it seemed to be about the internal affairs of 11 Base. After listening for a while, she dipped a few pieces of meat and put them into Li Nanheng's bowl. Sure enough, after the man hung up the phone and returned, he saw the meat piled up like a small mountain in the bowl and glanced at her. What? Are you afraid I'll starve? You're treating me like a pig now. I have to do the same. Feng Ling blinked at him. Li Nanheng smiled. In the evening, after dinner, although the hot pot had been removed, every corner of the apartment seemed to be filled with the smell of hot pot. Feng Ling went to take a shower and saw that Li Nanheng, who had already taken a shower, was wearing a dark blue bathrobe and was lying casually on the bed in the bedroom. He was holding a remote control in his hand and watching TV. However, he kept changing the channel and there seemed to be nothing to watch. The curved screen TV hanging on the bedroom wall kept changing the programs of various channels, and the languages of various countries frequently changed. Feng Ling did not dry her hair. Her body was warm, but her hair was a little cold. She lifted the quilt at the end of the bed and crawled in. Then she crawled out of the quilt and approached the man. She was about to speak when from the corner of her eye, she saw that the file she had placed on the coffee table was placed on the bedside table. She hadn't had the time to look at what was inside all day. She originally wanted to play with him, but she was immediately attracted. She reached out to take a look. What exactly is inside? However, before her hand could touch it, her waist was suddenly held by the man's hand. She was wrapped in a bath towel. When the man turned her over and pressed her down on the bed, he quickly untied her. A few days ago, she didn't even have the time or mood to be intimate in the hospital. Right now, the man seemed to be unable to hold back. He kissed her eagerly and his breathing was heavy. This was also the first night after leaving the jungle and returning to normal life. Feng Ling's heart warmed and she took the initiative to respond. The man groaned on her body and the kiss on her lips almost turned into a fierce bite. This night, it was not an exaggeration to say that they were entangled to death. In the end, Feng Ling lost her strength and fell asleep. However, she woke up before dawn because she had a nightmare and could not sleep. She quietly got up and saw the file on the bedside table. She reached out to take it and opened it. After flipping through page by page, she saw the words Feng Ling and expelled from the base. Her gaze paused and she abruptly turned to look at the man who had woken up. Chapter 1270. Li Nanheng, what is this? Feng Ling held the document that removed her from the base. The man sat up on the bed and said indifferently, after dawn, I'll send you back to the Feng family. Feng Ling stared at him for a long time. In the end, she pursed her lips and suddenly felt that her shoulder outside the blanket was a little cold. It was so cold that she couldn't help but shiver. Li Nanheng saw it and was about to help her pull the blanket up, but Feng Ling abruptly moved to the side and avoided his hand. At the same time, she raised the document that removed her from the base and placed the contents of the removal and his signature and seal in front of him. Why? She didn't ask why she wanted him to return to the Feng family. Instead, she asked why he removed her from the base. Why did he remove her from the base? This was equivalent to completely kicking her out of 11 base. She could never go back. She didn't even have a way out. Even if the members of 11 base died, they would die with the name of 11 base. Being removed from the base was a punishment that only members who had made a particularly serious mistake would receive. Furthermore, after being removed from the base, they would never be able to enter again in this life. From now on, she wouldn't even be able to enter a training camp for newcomers, let alone be an instructor or a sniper team. Because she was completely unqualified. She was completely rejected by 11 base. Your father, Mr. Feng's last wish was for me to send you back to the Feng family, cut off all paths of retreat, and force you to go back. Li Nanheng didn't want to hide it from her. He knew that the Feng family had let you down, but he had no choice but to place the burden of the Feng family's future on you. You would only choose to go back when you had no way out. He hoped that you could truly grow up and that one day, you could become a towering tree of the Feng family and support the entire family. Asking me to cut off your path of retreat is equivalent to cutting off everything for me. Li Nanheng looked at her. I can understand his thoughts and try my best to respect his last wish. However, the only thing I can do is to make you never return to the base again. It's impossible for me to cut off all contact with you. Feng Ling's hand trembled as she held the document. It turned out that her father had called Li Nanheng into the emergency room and told him this at the last moment of his life. Most of what 11 base has experienced is a matter of life and death. This kind of danger only exists on the surface. Whether we live or die, we will have a good time. Li Nanheng said, in the outside world, people kill without spilling blood. That's the real danger. After experiencing despair and pain, perhaps you will grow. Perhaps you will become braver and stronger because you've risked everything, but I don't intend to let you experience that. I can't abandon you. I'll accompany you to grow. Even if I'm not in the base in the future, I'll always stand by your side, En. As the man spoke, he raised his hand to pull her out of the quilt and hug her. However, Feng Ling's eyes were cold and she moved back an inch. Her voice was indifferent and emotionless. She only said, Li Nanheng, you said you would never push me away. I didn't push you away. Li Nanheng looked into her eyes. I will accompany you. I will change my identity and role. I will no longer be Boss Li, but just Li Nanheng. When Feng Ling heard this, she suddenly smiled and put down the document in her hand. Her bare shoulders outside the quilt felt cold. Do you know what 11 base is to me? I know. Then do you know what this document that removed me from 11 base represents? Feng Ling looked at him, and her eyes gradually became bloodshot. However, she still forced herself to suppress it and clenched the quilt tightly with her fingers. I know. I once told Feng Mingzhu that since I was a child, I had nothing. The only thing I had was 11 base behind me. But I didn't expect that one day, I would be removed from the base. It was no longer as simple as driving me away. Instead, I was removed from the base and cut off all the connections between me and 11 base. Li Nanheng, how can you do this? Li Nanheng's voice was very, very light, as if the wind would blow it away at any time. But I didn't expect that one day, I would be removed from the base. Feng Ling, listen to me. The business world is not like the battlefield. If you want the Feng family, you have to cut off ties with the base. Otherwise, you don't have to say it. I understand. Feng Ling looked at him coldly. I understand all the stakes. As long as I'm no longer a member of 11 Base, the grudges between me and the terrorists I've fought with will disappear. If there's any trouble, they won't look for me first but will only target 11 Base, right? I understand everything. I understand everything. Even now, you haven't even asked me a word and have already made all the decisions for me. Do I have any chance to object? Even if I cry, throw a tantrum, or beg you endlessly, I still can't go back, because all of this has already been decided in your hands. Feng Ling slammed the stack of documents in her hand on the pillow in front of him. Li Nanheng, have you ever asked me a word? Have you ever considered my thoughts? Even if you asked me if I was willing or not, even if you asked me once. Feng Ling stared at him and felt as if there was a taste of rust in her throat. The bitterness made her voice hoarse. Li Nanheng, what right do you have to make decisions for me? I was an outstanding member of the team in the base. I, Feng Ling, was the best sniper in 11 Base. I trained a group of outstanding and qualified newcomers. My everything is there. You, Li Nanheng, what right do you have to drive me away? Feng Ling gritted her teeth and said the last few words. When the man was about to silently hold her in his arms, Feng Ling suddenly shouted angrily, "Don't touch me. Feng Ling, don't call my name, and don't touch me." Feng Ling tried her best to calm her breathing and then slowly got up from the bed. Even though she was naked, she didn't seem to notice. She opened the cabinet and took out a set of clothes. Her movements were somewhat mechanical as she put them on in front of him. Feng Ling, calm down. Don't lose your temper. Although I made arrangements for you, I did it for you, you don't have to say anything. I'm very calm. Feng Ling glanced at him for the last time. You want me to go back to the Feng family, right? All right, I'll do as you wish. Li Nanheng's eyelids twitched. He had thought of Feng Ling's reaction. She would be angry. She might even be so angry that she would hit him, scold him, and question him hysterically. He didn't expect her to be so calm. She was so calm that Li Nanheng, who had already arranged everything for her and wanted to help her pave a way out, panicked for no reason. Chapter 1271. When Feng Ling turned to walk out, she suddenly saw the black base uniform she had changed out of yesterday folded in the open cabinet door. Looking at the uniform, her eyes were filled with a bone-chilling coldness. The words, expulsion, and the seal on the document kept appearing in her mind. The jungle she had lived in since she was young had been burned down, and her cabin was gone. She thought that she could accept all of this calmly because at least she still had 11 Base and Li Nanheng. But she never expected she would be removed from 11 Base. At this moment, she had nothing left. What a good Li Nanheng. He clearly knew how painful it would be for her to be cut, but he actually could bear to do it. Feng Ling clenched her fists tightly in her sleeves and walked out quickly. Feng Ling. Stop. Li Nanheng abruptly got out of bed, put on his pants, rushed out, and grabbed her wrist. Feng Ling knew that she couldn't shake him off, so she didn't struggle. She only staggered when the man grabbed her. When she regained her balance, she turned to look at him. I want to go out and be quiet. Her voice was calm. Li Nanheng held her wrist tightly. No, stay here. When you've thought it through, I'll send you back to the Feng family. Li Nanheng, I've tried my best not to yell at you. Let me go out and be quiet. Don't force me. Feng Ling's eyes gradually turned red. I'd rather you yell at me than hold it in like this. Before you really think it through, you can't leave my sight. What right do you have to restrict me? I'm no longer a member of your base. I have my freedom. Feng Ling couldn't help but raise her voice. Let go. Because I'm your man? I'm your future husband. Li Nanheng did not hesitate at all. He had no intention of letting go. At this moment, Feng Ling suddenly smiled. What did you just say? You cut off my path of retreat, but you can't bear to cut off everything about me. You can't do it, you can't bear to, can you? Little by little, Feng Ling looked into his eyes and slowly pulled her hand away from his wrist. When she finally pulled her hand out, she took a step back and rejected all his touch. She said coldly, "All right, I'll do it for you. I'll cut it for you." What do you mean? Li Nanheng's eyelids twitched. Li Nanheng, let's break up. Feng Ling's voice was soft but clear. Take back what you said. I'll pretend I never heard it. There's no need to take it back. Feng Ling looked at him coldly. Do you want to cut off my retreat? All right, I'll do it myself. Feng Ling. Li Nanheng. From now on, I have nothing to do with you. If you dare to follow me and pester me again, I will call the police. I am no longer a member of 11 Base. I enjoy the legal rights of an ordinary American citizen. I'll call the police. I will do my best to cut off everything with you. With that, she turned around, pushed open the door, and strode out, leaving the fierce-looking man behind, and entered the elevator without looking back. She walked out of the apartment with anger. When she passed by a flower bed, the various external and internal injuries she had suffered from many years ago suddenly exploded in her heart. The wounds on her shoulders, back, and body that had long healed without any scars were screaming in pain. Inch by inch, she felt that something was really cutting her heart. She was in so much pain that her entire body was trembling. Suddenly, she felt a fishy taste in her throat. She stumbled and fell to the side of the flower bed, spitting out a mouthful of blood. She watched helplessly as a large mouthful of blood spurted out. She stood there stiffly for a long time, staring at the blood. Then, she took a deep breath, got up, and continued to walk out. When she was about to walk out of the apartment, the two security guards saw the blood on the corner of her mouth and chin and hurriedly came out to ask her what was wrong, but Feng Ling walked out blankly as if she didn't hear them. Until the roadside, she didn't even look at the alternating traffic lights. She just crossed the road as if she couldn't see all the cars passing by quickly. Several cars were forced to stop by her ghost-like figure on the road. They were so angry that they stopped their cars and kept honking at her. Someone even stuck out his head and scolded her if she was crazy. Hearing this, Feng Ling turned her eyes and looked coldly at the person who was scolding her. As soon as the people in the car saw the blood on the corner of her mouth and the cold eyes that seemed to be able to freeze people's hearts, they subconsciously closed their mouths, cursed her in a low voice, and quickly drove the car behind her. A few minutes later, the security guard saw Li Nanheng walking out quickly. He hurried forward and asked, "Mr. Li, did something happen?" Li Nanheng had just passed by the flower bed and ignored the security guard's words. His eyes were searching outside, but in the next moment, he suddenly heard the security guard say, "We just saw the lady who came back with you yesterday. Just now, she seemed to be uncomfortable and vomited something." They didn't dare to say that they saw her vomit blood. After all, it sounded scary. How could a person suddenly vomit such a big mouthful of blood? It was not a martial arts drama. Li Nanheng's eyes paused because of the security guard's words and he turned to look at the flower bed. He only saw a dark dried blood stain on the edge of the flower bed. Blood? He seemed to remember that in the jungle a few days ago, when Feng Ling carried Qin Qiu out, her stomach had been uncomfortable. The day before the incident, she had just vomited and went to the hospital. At that time, she was not feeling well, but she endured all the discomfort and rushed into the sea of fire to carry Qin Qiu out. Later, her complexion had been very bad. Even Li Nanheng thought that she was in a bad state because of the death of her parents. In the next few days, she suffered a series of heavy blows, but she endured it and did not say anything. She did not cry or complain but quietly and sensibly worked hard to live a good life. Looking at the bloodstain, Li Nanheng instantly felt his temples throbbing. He walked out quickly, only to see the cars driving back and forth on the road and Fong Ling had disappeared. She only wore a set of clothes when she left and did not bring her cell phone with her. Li Nanheng went outside and quickly ran around but did not find her. He then drove around and finally drove back. He asked the security guard to check the surveillance cameras in and out of the community. At the same time, he called the traffic bureau to find all the surveillance cameras on the nearby routes. He shouldn't have been so angry at Fong Ling's words that he delayed for a few minutes. He should have chased after her and detained her. He couldn't let her leave in such a daze. Chapter 1272. Li Nanheng's hand was on the steering wheel. The car circled around within a radius of more than 10 miles, looking for her. As long as he could find her, he would search for any place where there could be people. After searching for several hours, he still couldn't find Fong Ling. At that time, she clearly couldn't have gone too far. She didn't bring anything with her, nor could she have left by car. He had watched the videos submitted by the security guards of the community and the traffic bureau one by one. He could only see Fong Ling walking out of the community alone and crossing the road like a ghost several times in a row. Li Nanheng's brows twitched violently. She had never felt any kinship since she was young. Although the sudden death of her parents was a huge blow to her, it wasn't as big as being removed from 11 base. At the very least, when her parents passed away, Fong Ling could still maintain her sobriety and rationality. However, being removed from 11 base had clearly destroyed her last bit of rationality. In the surveillance footage, Fong Ling had been walking on foot. Combined with all the surveillance footage, it could be seen that she had walked to a lake park 6 to 7 kilometers away before disappearing. She must have entered the park. This was a park used to enjoy the flowers, the lake, and the fitness. There were exits on all sides and surveillance cameras, but the surveillance camera at the back suddenly broke down this week. Fong Ling disappeared after entering the park. Li Nanheng went to search around the park and guarded the exit for a long time, but he didn't see Fong Ling. If it was the Fong Ling from a few years ago, he believed that she wouldn't do anything stupid. She was strong-willed and would never allow her to give in to everything. However, what had happened recently, as well as Fong Ling's habit of learning how to rely on him and how to soften her temper and personality, all sorts of things piled up together. Recalling the pool of blood by the flower bed, Li Nanheng's expression was so dark that it could drip water. He slapped the steering wheel heavily and continued to drive to the north gate of the park. He knew that whether he forced her or coaxed her step by step to solve this matter tactfully, the result would be the same. Even if they had been intimate last night, even if she had taken the initiative to crawl under the blanket and lie on him yesterday. At this moment, she had disappeared without a trace. Li Nanheng found that he often couldn't find her. The reason was that she was different from others. Others would definitely bring a cell phone when they went out, but she often forgot to bring her cell phone. It was difficult to find her even if he wanted to find her. He wished he could tie such a woman to his side every day to prevent her from disappearing at any time. How could he push her away? He would never push her away. But Fong Ling did not accept it. After searching for a long time, he suddenly saw many cars stopping on the road ahead. Li Nanheng rolled down the window and heard someone shouting nearby that there was a car accident ahead. A young girl was hit by a car and was unconscious. Li Nanheng's eyelids twitched and he hurriedly drove the car over. When he rushed into the crowd, he squeezed through the crowd, only to see that the person lying on the ground was a woman with long hair and exquisite makeup who was wearing a fashionable skirt and carrying a delicate small bag. He heaved a sigh of relief. Seeing that someone had lifted the young woman who had fallen in a pool of blood in front of the car, Li Nanheng backed the car away. After withdrawing from the crowd, he looked at the bustling road that had begun to be blocked, parked the car by the side of the road, leaned back in the chair, and drove north. His mind was filled with the scene of Fong Ling saying ruthless words before she went out, but her eyes were clearly bloodshot. The car window rolled down. The man placed one hand on the steering wheel and the other hand took out a cigarette from the car's storage box. He smoked several cigarettes in a row, but he couldn't get rid of the frustration in his heart. When the road ahead was clear, he continued to drive the car. He walked back and forth on all the roads outside the north gate of the park countless times. From dawn to dusk, the car drove away and back countless times. It was as if Fong Ling was born with the knowledge of how to avoid the crowd. Or perhaps it was some of the habits of growing up in a wolf's cave that made her used to choosing a path where no one could see her when she was in a bad mood. Thus, from morning to night, no one had found her, and no one had seen her along the way. For 3 whole days. Fong Ling disappeared for 3 whole days. In 3 days, Li Nanheng shuttled through the streets and alleys of Los Angeles alone. At the same time, he mobilized the search team of 11 base and some police to look for her. The Fong family's villa. In the front yard of the villa, there were 2 gardeners who were repairing the garden flowers that had withered due to the cold weather. When the servants came out of the door, they whispered to each other for a while and then sighed. Who would have thought that in one night, Mrs. Fong and Mr. Fong would suddenly leave the Fong family? The murderer of that strange fire was actually the eldest Miss Fong Mingzhu. There were suddenly 3 people missing in this big family, leaving only 2 old people. It was really sad. Auntie Mai, who had been in the Fong family for many years, wanted to ask several times. Where was the second miss? Didn't they say that the second miss was still alive? Why didn't the second miss come back? However, seeing that the 2 elders of the Fong family needed the psychological comfort and counseling of a psychiatrist every day to barely survive, Auntie Mai did not dare to ask. She could only serve them carefully every day, afraid that their emotions would be unstable and something would happen to them. The Fong family's reputation in Los Angeles was very high. It was definitely a famous family. This storm had caused the Fong family's momentum to decline. After all, the foundation of the Fong Corporation could not be guarded by 2 old people. The pillar of the Fong family had died in that fire, and the entire family seemed to have fallen into a vicious cycle. The 2 of them were already so old, and no one had any hope for the Fong family. Even though a skinny camel was still bigger than a horse, the era of the Fong family in the Chinese world of Los Angeles seemed to be coming to an end. Today, the psychiatrist came to visit the 2 elders on time. He had just finished talking to them and left when Auntie Mai came out to send him off. After sending the doctor off, she was about to turn around when she accidentally saw a thin figure from the corner of her eye. She paused and turned to see a somewhat disheveled figure standing by the roadside not far from the main entrance of the Fong family. When she saw the face that was somewhat similar to Mrs. Feng's and Mr. Feng's, Auntie Mai was slightly surprised. She quickly turned around and went in. "Grandfather, madam, is the person outside the second miss?" Today, the psychiatrist came to visit the 2 elders on time. When they heard this, they quickly got up and walked out of the front door of the Fong family's front yard. As expected, they saw Fong Ling standing there, but she was in a sorry state. Her clothes seemed to have not been changed for 2 to 3 days. Her face was pale and bloodless, and there was a shadow in her eyes that she had not slept for several days. Her clothes were cold and wet, sticking to her body as though she had been drenched by the freezing rain last night. Fong Ling. When Madame Fong saw her, she was very excited and rushed over. Fong Ling had been standing outside for a long time. The moment she saw the 2 elders of the Fong family, she wanted to smile, but her vision turned black and she fainted weakly on the ground. Chapter 1273. Old Madame Fong cried out in shock as she watched her granddaughter, who had appeared in front of the Fong family, suddenly fall to the ground. She was old and her legs were not nimble. As she ran, she called out, "Quick, help her up." Grandfather Fong walked over quickly and saw Fong Ling being carefully helped up by the servants and gardeners. He frowned. "What's wrong with this child? She didn't look so thin in the hospital a few days ago. How did she become so thin in just a few days? Hurry up and help her in. Call a doctor over." Old Madame Fong stepped forward and touched Fong Ling's cold face. Her heart ached and she couldn't help but say excitedly, "My little granddaughter is actually home." "Child, my little granddaughter." When the servants heard this, they didn't dare to delay. They quickly picked up Fong Ling, who was so thin that she didn't weigh much, and brought her into the villa as quickly as possible. Auntie Mai personally helped the unconscious Fong Ling into the bathroom and helped her take a hot shower. She then helped her change into a clean set of clothes and quickly sent her to the bed. The two family doctors from the Fong family had already arrived. As soon as they entered, they quickly examined her. After confirming that Fong Ling had changed her clothes, Grandfather Fong walked in. He stood in the spacious bedroom with his wife and watched Fong Ling, who was lying motionless on the bed. Although Fong Ling was nearly 1.7 meters tall and wasn't considered short among Eastern women, she was too thin. Lying in the 2-meter-wide bed, she was covered with a white down quilt. Her face was almost as white as the quilt. Her hair was still wet and scattered on the pillow. She looked small and fragile, as though she would shatter with a single touch. This was no longer the Fong Ling who had personally carried her parents out of the fire in the jungle wearing a heat-resistant suit. "How is it? What happened to her?" Seeing that the two doctors had been examining her for a while, the old lady walked over worriedly and asked. "Madam Fong, don't worry. Don't be anxious. Her life isn't in danger. It's just that she hasn't eaten for days. In addition, her stomach has suffered from severe gastric bleeding in the past few days. Right now, she's only unconscious because her physical strength can't take it anymore. Don't worry." "Stomach bleeding?" The old lady stood by the bed and looked at Fong Ling's pale face with heartache. After returning to the Fong family, she faced this empty villa for several days. Finally, because of Fong Ling, she felt that this house was no longer so empty. "Leave this place to the doctor first," Grandfather Fong said softly. "Since this child is willing to come back, it's a good thing. We'll talk about it when she wakes up." The news that the second miss of the Fong family had returned revived the entire Fong family. In particular, old Madame Fong was not in a good state a few days ago. In the past 2 days, her health had improved a lot. Even though Fong Ling had been unconscious for an entire day after returning, she had personally cooked a lot of nutritious medicinal soup for her little granddaughter. She had been boiling it on the fire, and the more it was boiled, the more delicious it became. She was waiting for Fong Ling to wake up so that she could drink it directly to nourish her body. Second Mrs. return is the happiest thing for Madame Dowager these days. Auntie Mai stood outside the kitchen and watched as old Madame Fong, who hadn't cooked for more than 10 years, worked busily inside. At the same time, she sighed and said to Grandfather Fong, who was standing outside the kitchen. Grandfather Fong didn't say anything, but Auntie Mai could tell from the two elders' eyes that they really hoped that second miss would stay in the Fong family in the future. She just didn't know what the second miss had experienced these days. How did she end up like this? She had been unconscious for a day and a night, and why did she suddenly return to the Fong family? Furthermore, when she returned, she didn't bring anything with her. Her identity document, wallet, cell phone, nothing. It was as though she had been wandering all the way back. She recalled that when she saw the second miss outside yesterday, she stood outside the door and looked at the Fong family's villa blankly. She then recalled what had happened to the second miss when she was 1 year old. She almost lost her life in the sea. To be able to survive and return to the Fong family one day was a great gift to the Fong family. It was no wonder that old master and old madam were so happy. In this family, their only hope now was second Mississippi. "Old man, Auntie Mai, quickly help me try it. How does it taste?" Old Madame Fong scooped out 2 small bowls of medicinal soup and handed it to them. "I didn't add much salt. When she wakes up, she should eat something lighter. See if it's tasty. Is it too bland?" Seeing the old lady's excitement, Auntie Mai smiled and tasted it. Not bad. It's very delicious. Second miss will definitely like it." Grandfather Fong also tasted it and nodded. "It's not bad. This time, Madame Fong was even happier. She quickly went back to cook. The old lady, who hadn't entered the kitchen for more than 10 years, was as excited as a child. Fong Ling returned to the Fong family. The news quickly reached Li Nanheng's ears. After confirming that nothing had happened to her outside and that she had suddenly returned to the Fong family after disappearing for 3 days, Li Nanheng's heart finally relaxed. However, at the same time, he began to worry. She said that as he wished. She said that she would personally cut it off. She went back without a word. Did she really plan to cut off the connection between them? How should he cut it? After nearly 8 years of separation and entanglement, how should he cut off the shadows that had long been rooted in their lives? That night, Li Nanheng drove the car to the Fong family's villa. However, he did not enter. Instead, he parked the car outside and looked at the few lit windows in the villa. One of them was a bedroom on the 3rd floor. The lights in that bedroom had never been lit up in the past few years, but now, they were lit up from night to night. Fong Ling should be living in this room right now. Looking at the light in the room, it was as though he could finally feel her existence. Li Nanheng got out of the car and walked over. He stood outside the door of the Fong family and looked at the light in the room. Occasionally, he would see the figures of servants passing by the window. He stood there for an entire night. When the sky brightened, Li Nanheng spat out a ball of white air from his mouth. He still did not leave. At this moment, Auntie Mai sent the doctor out. Just as she walked out, she suddenly saw Li Nanheng, who had been standing outside for a long time. She was surprised. "Mr. Li?" Li Nanheng answered mildly, "N. You are." Auntie Mai looked at him in disbelief. It was 6:00 in the morning. When did he come? So early? Could it be that he had been standing all night? Hurry up and read the latest update. Chapter 1274. Is she okay? Li Nanheng ignored the confusion and surprise in Auntie Mai's eyes and asked. Auntie Mai had also heard about the second miss in 11 base. Furthermore, the second Miss Cenotaph was related to Mr. Li in name. She immediately answered, "Are you talking about the second miss?" "She's fine, but she hasn't woken up yet." Li Nanheng's brows suddenly twitched. "What do you mean she hasn't woken up? What happened to her?" "The doctor stayed here all night and just left," Auntie Mai said truthfully. "The second miss suddenly returned to the Fong family the day before yesterday. At that time, her clothes were all wet, and her face was frighteningly pale. We just found her, and she fainted on the spot. It's been 2 days, but the second miss hasn't woken up yet." Li Nanheng frowned and looked at the room where Fong Ling was staying. The doctor came to see her earlier and said that the second miss should have had a serious gastric hemorrhage in the past few days. After that, she starved outside for a few days and didn't eat anything. In the past 2 days, there have been 2 freezing rains. She must have been in the freezing rain and caught a cold. Coupled with the problem with her stomach, she is extremely haggard. Yesterday, she was only unconscious. I thought she would wake up today, but last night, the second miss suddenly had a high fever and kept it above 39 degrees. We were so scared that we quickly called the doctor over. The doctor stayed here all night and didn't leave until the second miss's fever subsided." Thinking of the pool of blood by the flower bed that day, Li Nanheng's heart felt as though it had been pierced by countless thorns. How many days had her stomach hurt, but she refused to say a word. He wanted to go in to see her, but this was the Fong family, especially since he had personally rushed back to the Fong family from the base. No matter what the consequences were, he should bear it himself. The master of the family did not come forward to invite him, and he, a junior, barged in. No matter what, it was unreasonable. "She's awake, she's awake. The second miss is awake." All of a sudden, a servant's voice came from inside. Hearing this, Auntie Mai immediately turned around and was about to walk back when she suddenly turned back to look at Li Nanheng. "Mr. Li, go in and take a look." Please come out and tell me after you're done, Li Nanheng said in a low voice. Ah, okay. Auntie Mai knew that this young Master Li was famous for being not to be trifled with. Seeing that he was so polite and had no intention of barging into the Feng family, she couldn't figure out what was going on between him and the second Mississippi. She nodded and quickly returned to the villa. Feng Ling was indeed awake. She struggled in the darkness and vaguely heard some movements by her ears. From time to time, she heard someone talking. She struggled in the darkness for a long time and finally found a trace of light. She tried her best to open her eyes, but it was only a small slit. She frowned and closed her eyes again. Her head. It hurt. After running a high fever for a whole night, he felt sore all over. Second Miss, are you awake? Someone said. Who? Feng. Feng Ling's thoughts were a bit muddled. Although the voice by her ears was full of concern, it was an unfamiliar voice. She subconsciously opened her eyes. When she finally opened her eyes, she saw an unfamiliar middle-aged woman standing by the bed and looking at her. She's awake. Quick. The helper saw that her eyes were open. Although they were not focused, she rushed out excitedly to call for someone. Second Miss is awake. Quick. Go tell the old madam and the old master. After a while, many people came into the room. Although Feng Ling's eyes were open, she was still unconscious. After a long while, she barely recognized that the people who walked in were Grandmother Feng and Grandfather Feng. Feng Ling, good child. How are you? Does it hurt anywhere? You had a high fever for an entire night yesterday. Grandma was so worried. Grandmother Feng leaned over the bed to look at her. She gently stroked Feng Ling's forehead. Thankfully, you're finally awake. Feng Ling closed her eyes again, composed herself, and opened them again. She remembered that she didn't know where to go. She walked and rested when she was tired. Later, she passed by a shop under the Feng family's name and heard the manager say that she was going to the Feng family's villa. He said that it was not far from that location, so she subconsciously followed. However, after following a villa area, the car drove in. She couldn't keep up with it on foot, so she walked around the villa area. When she reached the door of the Feng family's mansion, she inadvertently saw the old madam's figure in the window. Then she stood there and didn't leave. Later, what happened next? She had a headache and the entire world seemed to be dark. In the past 3 days, she didn't remember where she had been. Her head hurt, her body felt uncomfortable, and her stomach hurt so much that her memory of the past 3 days was blurry. She only remembered that she had been walking, and in the end, she actually walked back to the Feng family. Feng Ling, can you hear Grandma? Seeing that she didn't respond, Grandmother Feng quickly held her hand. If you're not feeling well and don't want to speak, just blink and tell me. Feng Ling looked at her and her dry lips moved. She said hoarsely and weakly, I can hear you. Seeing that she was willing to speak, Grandmother Feng smiled in relief. All right. Grandma won't disturb you. If you're tired, continue sleeping. This is the Feng family, your home. You can rest as long as you want. We have to take good care of our bodies. We can't be sick like this. Feng Ling indeed didn't have much strength to speak. She only felt that Grandmother Feng's hand was holding hers very tightly. Grandfather Feng also stood by the side and looked at her with a smile. The usually dignified old man faced the little granddaughter he had lost and regained. At this moment, his face was filled with benevolence. Auntie Mai walked to the bed and smiled at Feng Ling. Second Miss, I'm Auntie Mai. When you were young, I hugged you all day. In the future, you can tell me anything at home. Feng Ling glanced at Auntie Mai and nodded thoughtfully. Although the second miss was haggard and weak, she still had the right response. She was not as cold and unapproachable as others said. She immediately smiled and said, by the way, Mr. Li is here. He seems to have been standing outside for an entire night. Second miss, do you want to see him? Mr. Li? Fong Ling's mind was in a mess. It was painful and messy, but when she heard these words, the blank emotions in her eyes gradually calmed down. She did not speak and closed her eyes. Auntie Mai thought she would agree, but seeing that Fong Ling's expression didn't seem to have any intention of seeing Li Nanheng, she couldn't make up her mind and could only stand by the bed to look at her. Hurry up and read the latest update. Chapter 1275. After hearing Mr. Li's words, Grandfather Fong said, Nanheng is here? Yes, I saw Mr. Li outside, but he didn't come in. Auntie Mai nodded. In Grandfather Feng's impression, Li Nanheng was really good to Fong Ling. A few days ago, although he was not in the mood in the hospital, he had coincidentally met him a few times. It could be seen that Li Nanheng really cared about Fong Ling. But why did Fong Ling suddenly come back alone and cause him such a mess? When Li Nanheng arrived at the Fong family, he did not enter. Fong Ling heard that he had come, but she did not speak or let him in. Grandfather Fong temporarily defined their situation as a quarrel, but after the quarrel, the Fong family still knew to return to the Fong family. This was a great relief to them. Child, if you're still tired, take care of your body. If you want to see him, we'll let Nanheng in, but if you don't want to see him for the time being, it's fine, Elder Fong said. No, Fong Ling said. Although her voice was hoarse, she could hear her determination. Her tone startled Madame Fong, who had been holding her hand. She looked at her closed eyes and asked warmly, Did you quarrel with Nanheng? Fong Ling did not answer. It was as though hearing Li Nanheng's name had caused her to lose all her patience. She furrowed her brows and was about to withdraw her hand when the old madam held it tightly. All right, Grandma won't ask any more. Don't be angry. Seeing her emotional conflict with Li Nanheng, Madame Fong quickly continued to hold her hand. At the same time, she turned to Auntie Mai and said, Then go tell him. Don't let him wait outside. All right. Auntie Mai responded and looked at Fong Ling. Seeing that she really had no intention of seeing Li Nanheng, she could only turn and walk out. When she arrived outside, she saw that Li Nanheng was still standing there. There were no extra cigarette butts by his feet. He seemed to have been standing outside quietly for a long time. Mr. Li, Auntie Mai walked out and said softly, I'm very sorry. Although second miss is awake, she doesn't seem to be in a good state of mind. She sleeps and wakes up. It might not be convenient for her to see you. These words were too tactful. In fact, Fong Ling didn't want to see him, didn't intend to see him, and didn't want to see him. He knew her temper very well, but Li Nanheng didn't expect that the expulsion document would make her so angry. It's okay. Let her rest more, Li Nanheng said indifferently. After a pause, he said in a low voice, Take good care of her. Mr. Li, don't worry. The second miss is the treasure we lost and found. And you know, in this big Fong family, she is the only one worth remembering. We will definitely take good care of her. The Fong family will give her the best and won't let the second miss suffer the slightest grievance. As Auntie Mai spoke, she sighed with emotion. Her eyes were a little red. It's really not easy. Second miss is still alive. She's alive at home now. Li Nanheng didn't say much but glanced at the window of Fong Ling's room. Mr. Li, I'll go in first. The weather has been cold recently, and it often rains. Don't stand outside. Don't catch a cold, Auntie Mai said with concern. Auntie Mai said with concern. Seeing Li Nanheng nod indifferently, she quickly turned around and returned to the villa. After returning to the room, she thought she could still talk to the second miss, but when she entered, she saw the two elders of the Fong family carefully close the bedroom door and quietly walk out. Second miss is asleep again? After all, Auntie Mai had hugged and coaxed the second miss every day and night when she was young. This relationship had long surpassed familial love. Of course, she wanted to talk to her now, but she didn't expect the bedroom door to be closed just like that. She immediately asked. "Shoo," matriarch Feng gestured to her. She had a fever last night and only woke up for a few minutes. Her strength still can't hold on. After listening to me for a while, she fell asleep again. Let her sleep. Feng Ling was really asleep, and in the past 2 days after waking up, she hadn't recovered. She woke up and slept, and the time she slept was clearly much longer than when she was awake. In the past 2 days, the Feng family had really taken good care of her. Whether it was the 2 elders of the Feng family or all the servants who could come into contact with Feng Ling, they all felt sorry for her and took good care of her. Their tone was filled with, "Second miss, you're finally back." However, Feng Ling was in a daze. She couldn't respond to the concern of the people in the Feng family. At most, when the old lady came to talk to her, she would say a few words to her and then fall asleep in exhaustion. After sleeping like this for 2 days, she woke up again and felt much better. At the same time, she heard 2 servants whispering by the bed. "He's still outside?" "That's right. Auntie Mai and I went out to buy something earlier. When we came back, we saw that the car was still there. The 2 of them haven't driven it away. Didn't our madam call him in for dinner? But he didn't come in. He just waited outside. Could it be that he's really waiting for our second miss? What a coincidence. Second Miss Cenotaph is married to the Lee family, and Mr. Lee is deeply in love with our second Mississippi. Second Miss doesn't say she wants to see him, but he's been waiting outside. There must be some story between the 2 of them." After hearing these words, Feng Ling just lay there quietly and did not speak. One of the servants saw that she had woken up and rushed over to ask her if she wanted to drink or eat. Feng Ling only blinked and remained silent. This time, after she woke up, she did not fall asleep again. Even if she closed her eyes, she still could not fall asleep. The 2 servants thought she had fallen asleep and patiently guarded her while continuing to chat quietly. They were mostly talking about Li Nanheng standing outside the Feng family for the past 2 days. After an unknown period of time, the servants suddenly got up to close the window. "It's raining again. Every year at this season, there will always be a few freezing rains. It's really cold." The servant was closing the window. When she looked out of the window, she suddenly paused and whispered in surprise, "Hey? Why isn't Mr. Lee in the car? It's already raining. Won't he catch a cold?" The 2 servants squeezed in front of the window and looked out. Sure enough, they saw the tall and straight figure standing by the car smoking, as though he was unaware of the sudden freezing rain. "If he gets drenched like this, he will catch a cold, right? Ask someone to send an umbrella to Mr. Lee." "Yes, send a coat." "I don't think Mr. Lee is wearing a coat. He seems to have left his coat here." "Aya, the person inside hasn't recovered yet. If the person outside is also sick, what should we do?" "Don't quarrel. Second Miss and Mr. Lee seem to be quite compatible. Sigh, I don't know what happened. Seeing Mr. Lee like this makes my heart ache." Howl, monthly votes, please, monthly votes, hurry up and read the latest update. Chapter 1276. The 2 servants thought that Feng Ling had fallen asleep, so they did not continue to guard the room. Before leaving, they took her temperature again. After confirming that her temperature was normal and there was no fever, they quietly left. Feng Ling opened her eyes and looked at the luxurious crystal chandelier and the spotless white ceiling. She heard the sound of the rain outside the window gradually getting heavier. The rain had been raining for a long time. Feng Ling closed her eyes and couldn't fall asleep. Of course, she was not feeling sorry for the people outside. Li Nanheng's physical fitness was very good. He wouldn't catch a cold or die just because of a freezing rain. She had nothing to feel sorry for or worry about. Even her current physical condition was due to her stomach bleeding, not eating for a few days, and being drenched in the rain. All of these factors added up together, causing her to collapse. Otherwise, she wouldn't have suddenly fallen so seriously ill. The Fong family people really gave Li Nanheng an umbrella and a coat. Li Nanheng did not accept it. He only thanked them and returned to the car, lest he kept causing trouble for them outside. Outside the car window, the rain was murmuring, and because it was too cold, a layer of white fog condensed on the car window. The man sat in the car and ignored the phone placed on the passenger seat. As if he did not hear it, he turned on the air conditioner in the car, lit a cigarette in his mouth, and then habitually glanced at the window of Fong Ling's room. This time, his gaze was fixed on the window. Because this time, it was not just the window where the servants passed by, but Fong Ling. In just a few days, she had indeed lost a lot of weight. At some point, she got up from the bed and walked to the window alone. Even though they were separated by such a long distance, they could see each other clearly. Li Nanheng suddenly met Fong Ling's eyes and quickly took out the cigarette in his mouth. Because he was too anxious, he did not even frown when the cigarette butt burned him. He thought that she heard that he was outside and was worried that he would get wet in the rain, so he quickly smiled in her direction, showing his goodwill and not wanting to fall out with her. However, as soon as he smiled, Fong Ling expressionlessly closed the curtains, completely cutting off the only window that Li Nanheng could find comfort in for 2 days. Li Nanheng's smile froze. In the days after Fong Ling woke up, she quietly stayed in the bedroom and did not go out. Later, when she learned that Li Nanheng had been invited by grandfather Fong, the two of them chatted for a while before Li Nanheng left the Fong family and did not continue to guard the door. She didn't know what they talked about, but Fong Ling didn't care. After adjusting her condition in the Fong family for a few days, she finally recovered a lot of energy and gradually accepted her role in the Fong family. At first, she only addressed them as Old Madam Fong and Old Mr. Fong, but gradually, because of the Fong family's enthusiasm and the atmosphere of the entire family's love for her, she gradually let go of her uncomfortable emotions and occasionally called them Grandpa and Grandma. The two elders of the Fong family were extremely excited. In the past few days, they had ordered one set of clothes after another for her. There were all kinds of styles, and they were all suitable for her size. They also bought a lot of necessities for her, and her room was almost full. Fong Ling had said several times that she didn't need to buy these things, but old Madame Fong always said that she owed her too much when she was young. Now that she had finally returned, if they didn't quickly think of a way to treat her well, the two of them would feel very uneasy. They were afraid that they didn't treat her well enough and wanted to treat her better. After living for nearly 22 years, this was the first time Fong Ling had been loved and doted on by her so-called relatives. The two elders of the Fong family would come to talk to her every day. Fong Ling's parents died unjustly, and they did not mention Fong Mingzhu's matter when they sat together. After all, they knew that Fong Mingzhu was the one who did it. She had long been arrested by the police, but after all, she was a child of the Fong family. Although the two elders hated her and would rather she plead guilty, they did not want to mention anything about Fong Mingzhu at home to add to their troubles. In this large Fong family, it was as though only the tight embrace of the grandparents and granddaughter could warm up the Fong family that seemed to be about to turn cold. As Fong Ling had been at home recently, she did not seem to have any intention of leaving, nor did she say that she would return to 11 base. Recently, when grandfather Fong occasionally went to take care of various aspects of the family business, he looked energetic and in good spirits. Li Nanheng did not come again, but the elders of the Li family often came to the Fong family in their own names. They often sent various new collections of good things to the Fong family. Fong Ling usually avoided them and had no contact with the Li family. After returning for a month, grandmother Fong was already used to Fong Ling being at home. She was no longer as afraid that she would suddenly disappear one day, but she was also used to sitting in Fong Ling's room and talking to her. "What do you think about Nanheng's matter?" Grandmother Fong looked at Fong Ling, who had already recovered a lot, and then at the white pajamas with lace on her body. She recalled Fong Ling's helpless gaze when she first wore these pajamas. When she gradually accepted these clothes that were too girly, and then looked at her calm expression that was used to accepting everything, the old lady's eyes were filled with a gratified smile. After returning for so long, the Feng family could tell that there was some conflict between Feng Ling and Li Nanheng. After Li Nanheng left, no one dared to mention his name in front of Feng Ling. This was the first time Grandmother Feng had asked about Li Nanheng so directly. Feng Ling did not speak. Grandmother Feng sat by her bed. Nanheng asked you to return to the Feng family, didn't he? Feng Ling still did not speak. I don't know what Nanheng talked to your grandfather about before he left that day, but our Feng family and the Li family have a good relationship. Your grandfather and I don't object to your relationship with Nanheng. Besides, there was an even more coincidental thing. It was your cenotaph, Grandma. Feng Ling interrupted her softly. I went to 11 base when I was 13. It's been more than 8 years, almost 9 years. All kinds of people in front of me are from the base. Now that I've walked out, I should accept the outside world. I'm trying to adjust my state. For the time being, I don't want to mention anyone related to the past. Grandmother Feng paused and looked at Feng Ling. Li Nanheng was also included in that anyone related to the past category. However, seeing that Feng Ling really had no intention of continuing to mention this matter, and ever since she came back, she had never mentioned the words Li Nanheng. Grandmother Feng could only respect her and nodded. All right, then Grandma won't talk about it anymore. As long as you're fine, it's more important than anything else. W. 4M. Chapter 1277. It was the 5th month after Feng Ling returned to the Feng family. Almost everyone in 11 base lost contact with Feng Ling. She seemed to have suddenly disappeared from the world a few months ago. She changed her cell phone number and never came back. When everyone realized the problem, they inquired about it and learned that Feng Ling had been removed from the base and would not be able to come back with any position in the base in the future. From now on, she was only an outsider of 11 base. In the 8th month after Feng Ling returned to the Feng family, the Feng family moved to New York because the Feng family's business had shifted to New York. After leaving Los Angeles, only an old servant was left in the Feng family's villa to clean it occasionally. The others followed her to New York. From then on, there was no news of Feng Ling. During the Spring Festival, Old Master Li finally waited for Li Nanheng to return home. He hadn't been back for several months. Recently, he had been on several missions. Although he wasn't injured, he was obviously colder than before. When he blocked him at the door, Grandfather Li looked at him coldly. Do you still remember the bet you made with me? Li Nanheng had just returned from a mission. If it weren't for the Spring Festival, he would have returned to the base. Suddenly being called back by Grandfather Li, he just wanted to sleep and didn't want to say anything. However, he was suddenly blocked at the door by Grandfather Li. Li Nanheng's expression was cold. What bet? If you can't let me hold a great-grandson within a year, get back from the base obediently. Go back to the Li Corporation to manage the Li family's business for me and hand the base to Ah Feng. Grandfather Li looked at him coldly. As a man, you must do what you say. How dare you say you forgot what you promised? Li Nanheng, I've already given you so much time. Don't talk about giving birth to a big fat great-grandson for me. You can't even see Feng Ling now. Isn't it time to fulfill your promise? Put down the matter of the base and hurry back to the Li Corporation. Li Nanheng looked at the determination in Grandfather Li's eyes and knew that he couldn't avoid it this time. But it was good. After he personally removed Feng Ling from the base, every time he returned to the base, he would look at the stamp he had stamped on that document, and every time he passed by all the places Feng Ling had been to in the base, his heart would ache. Since it was time to let it go, Ah Feng was one of them, so it was okay to hand it over to Ah Feng. It had been so many years. It was indeed time. The 2nd year after Feng Ling returned to the Feng family, she was brought into the Feng Corporation's family business by Grandfather Feng to study. However, because Feng Ling had not had much contact with this aspect since she was young, she discovered many problems after 2 months of study. After obtaining Fong Ling's consent, Grandfather Fong helped her apply to study in England for a year. Grandfather Fong had many familiar friends in England. He had a famous tutor in the financial world named Zand. He had helped him before, so he had asked Fong to go to Zand to help Fong Ling to England to study. In the beginning, Fong Ling only agreed. There was nothing to refuse. Since she was back, the Fong family really needed her to support this family after she gradually grew up. She had her own responsibilities, so she could accept any arrangement. In the end, she did not expect that Jean Wan's tutor in England was actually Mr. Zand. She had just arrived in England and had just found someone when she bumped into Jean Wan. However, Jean Wan had already been in England for 2 years, and her entire temperament had changed. Fong Ling did not mention much about herself in front of Jean Wan. She only said that she was here to study. Coincidentally, she was currently studying business management and various business and financial matters. Jean Wan's MN group was also lacking people, so Fong Ling decided to stay and study with them while working. It was just nice that she could accompany Jean Wan. When she first arrived in England, Jean Wan had been working overtime all day because N group's situation had fallen to a low point. Although Fong Ling had come to study, she was used to taking care of her, so she often stayed by her side to work with her. She often helped Jean Wan pour coffee and pack her things. Occasionally, she would act as Jean Wan's chauffeur and protect her just like when she was in High City. However, after all, she could not follow her around like before. Jean Wan was now the CEO of N Group, and it was not convenient for Fong Ling to follow her to many occasions. Fong Ling was worried about Jean Wan, so she simply asked Jean Wan to take some time out every day to learn some self-defense skills from her. Jean Wan was quite willing to learn. Every day, after working out, she would take an hour or two to learn various movements from Fong Ling in the gym. She would also learn from Fong Ling how to recognize the various acupuncture points in the human body. Fong Ling's days of studying in England, because of her company with Jean Wan, felt that the days passed very quickly. It was not as perfunctory and forced as she had imagined. She gradually adapted to the so-called struggle in the business world in N Group. She personally watched as Jean Wan single-handedly supported N Group. With Mr. Zand's guidance and help, she watched as N Group gradually gained a place in the global Chinese community. Not only did Jean Wan benefit a lot from Fong Ling, but Fong Ling also benefited a lot from Jean Wan. Half a year after coming to England, Jean Wan happened to be ranked first on the Forbes list of female entrepreneurs under the age of 25. Taking advantage of her rare vacation, Jean Wan and Fong Ling made an appointment to go to a riverside village on the outskirts of London for a 2-day vacation. At night, the two women sat by a riverside on the outskirts of London, drinking wine and eating barbecue. Jean Wan had just drunk 2 cans of wine. She lay on the grass and looked up at the sky, saying, "Fong Ling, if I had known that you would walk the path of a businessman in the future, when we were in T-City, I should have pressed your head down and made you learn obediently. I remember that you didn't even take those business management books." Fong Ling also held a glass of wine in her hand and sat by her side with a faint smile. "How could I know what would happen in the future? Besides, I was only responsible for protecting you. The bodyguard's job was to ensure your safety. I didn't have the mood to learn those things. Besides, the professor's words were too profound. A beginner like me couldn't learn anything from him." "That's true. The way the professor taught back then wasn't suitable for you," Jean Wan said with a smile. "Mr. Zand is different." Jean Wan said with a smile, "Mr. Zand is different. What he teaches is not limited to paper, but for you to do it yourself and experience it. Just like when MN Group fell to the bottom, he could have helped me, but he deliberately left me hanging and let me struggle to get up on my own. At most, he would occasionally give me a few pointers, but now that I think about it, he is indeed a good leader. He knows what to do and what not to do. After all, the future is your own. There are many things that you can only know how to do after experiencing it for yourself. W. 4M Chapter 1278. Fong Ling sighed with a smile. You did teach me well, but it's clear that my comprehension in this aspect is not as fast as yours. Jean Wan lay on the ground and turned to look at her. It's because you've never really experienced the domestic business world. After seeing the bloodshed that's different from 11 base, you know what to do. Bloodshed? Fong Ling said lightly. She didn't know what was going on in her mind. Hearing the pause in her tone, Jean Wan sat up again and turned to look at her. You've been in England for so long, but I haven't asked you about the details. Why didn't you return to 11 base? From my understanding of you, even if you suddenly found out about your background or had any other choice, you wouldn't choose it. You would only choose to return to 11 base, but why? Fong Ling sat on the grass and looked down at the wine in her hand. After looking at it for a while, she still didn't say anything. She raised her head and drank the wine. Then she got up and took the empty wine cup. She said indifferently without looking back, "Let's go. Let's go back." Fong Ling was not a person who always liked to put aside her worries and talk about them, but she was very honest with Jean Wan. She had also peeled off her past in front of her and often told her everything she knew about her experience in 11 base. But in the 6 months she came to England, Jean Wan could see that although Fong Ling was no different from usual, her temperament, state, and eyes seemed to have changed. In the past, Fong Ling was just a Fong Ling who stubbornly wanted to live according to fate. Now, Fong Ling's eyes were calm and indifferent. She seemed to be indifferent to anything, but she was observant. After sending Jean Wan back to her own residence, Fong Ling drove back to another apartment nearby. Originally, Jean Wan wanted Fong Ling to live with her so that she could accompany her, but after all, Xiao Ba was living with Jean Wan. Although Fong Ling quite liked Xiao Ba, she couldn't stand being around Xiao Ba 24 hours a day, so she simply lived outside. However, the place she lived was very close to Jean Wan, and it was only 5 or 6 minutes walk. After returning to the apartment, Fong Ling took off her coat and immediately went to take a shower. After showering, she picked up the hairdryer and stood in front of the mirror to dry her hair. Her hair had already grown past her shoulders. There were several times when she wanted to cut it short, but Jean Wan stopped her. Jean Wan could tell that she didn't mention a word about Li Nanheng and 11 base. Even if she didn't know what had happened, she knew that Fong Ling's attitude toward the past was very resolute, as if she wanted to cut off everything. So Jean Wan said casually, "You've been dressing up as a tomboy for so many years. It's time for you to completely change yourself. There's no need to cut your hair. If you feel uncomfortable, you can get a simple haircut. It doesn't matter if you tie your hair up or let it down. Now that you're standing in front of me, I feel that you're indeed no longer the Fong Ling of the past, but if you keep your hair so short, I'll feel that you're still the same as before." Fong Ling didn't want to be like the past. She wanted to change. She indeed wanted to cut off all traces of her past, even if it was just a shadow that resembled her. Memories often made people think of many things. She didn't want to recall them. However, she didn't go to the barber shop outside to get her hair styled. Every day, she only wore a simple black baseball cap. Occasionally, her hair would be tied into a short ponytail, and occasionally, it would be scattered over her shoulders. She only wore a hat. She was still used to wearing sportswear because she felt comfortable and didn't feel restrained. However, Mr. Zand had specially said something about her usual dressing. He said that the British business world paid a lot of attention to etiquette. For some important signing occasions and business contacts, she had to wear formal clothes or gowns. It was not advisable for her to always dress like a student or a gym coach. After being pointed out by Mr. Zan several times, Fong Ling still had no intention of changing her mind. On the other hand, Xiao Ba and Jean Wan were anxious for her. MN Group was prospering by the day. Although Jean Wan was busy, she was not as tired as she had been in the past few months. It was rare for her to find time, so she and Xiao Ba tricked Fong Ling to a certain commercial street in London and brought her into a department store. It was one thing for Jean Wan, but Jin Wan also brought Xiao Ba along. Of the two of them, one was paying attention, and the other kept chatting by the side. Feng Ling looked at the clothes they had chosen for her and felt her head hurt. This dress isn't bad. It's a very plain style on the top, and there are some pleated designs on the bottom. It should be very smooth on your body. Jin Wan picked up a pearl-colored dress and raised it to Feng Ling. She waved it in front of Feng Ling. After making sure that Feng Ling's skin could handle any color, she stuck the dress to her body and said with great satisfaction, "Beautiful, this is very beautiful." Feng Ling, try it on quickly. Jin Wan. Feng Ling was helpless. She raised her hand and was about to push the clothes away when Jin Wan forcefully pressed the dress against her body and stared at her. "Don't you remember what I said? And what did Mr. Zand say about you? Have you forgotten that even if you don't like to wear it, you have to have a few pieces? Otherwise, when it comes to certain occasions, do you still want to borrow my clothes? I can borrow them, but our sizes are different. It won't be comfortable for you to wear them." Without waiting for Feng Ling to speak, Jin Wan turned back and asked the shop assistant to lead the way for Feng Ling to the fitting room. Feng Ling was helpless. She took the clothes into the fitting room. It wasn't that she had never worn dresses before. In the past, when she was in the base, she had worn them when she was dressed as a woman. They were sexier and tighter than this kind of clothes. At that time, she was not used to wearing them, but she had no choice but to wear them. Now, she was suddenly asked to change her style. In fact, the baseball cap and sportswear were really comfortable. She stood in the fitting room and looked at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She then looked at the pearl-colored dress in her hand. Xiao Ba stood outside and urged, "Feng Ling, don't waste time. CEOG specially took time out today to accompany you shopping for clothes. Her time is so precious right now, and she's still thinking about you. You should give her some face and quickly change your clothes." Feng Ling, a few minutes later. The door of the fitting room opened. The moment she saw Feng Ling walk out, Xiao Ba, who was waiting for her outside and drinking milk tea, almost splashed the milk tea all over herself. W. For M, you're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.